This is Dan Schneider. This is not going to be one of my usual Dan Schneider video interviews, nor is it going to be one of my Dan Schneider Files interviews. A few weeks back, I was contacted by a young man named Michael Gangone, and he wanted to interview me, and he had such an extensive list of queries and ideas that I suggested doing a series of interviews. So we might do 3, 4, 5. And so let me just turn it over to Michael. But before I do, let me just ask Michael, who's off camera, can you just maybe give me a little background about yourself and for the viewers in that who you are, how you found Cosmoetica and or my writings, and what you want to accomplish with these interviews?
Okay, so thank you very much for having me, Dan. So basically, what happened was, when I was 9 years old, I discovered that I really had a love for different things artistically. I was the best at playing guitar, but I really loved reading literature and I really loved watching movies. And my sister, God bless her, she actually got me into an art school, Orange County High School of the Arts, where I was in the music program, but I got exposed to different types of arts, both in the academic part of it and also in just the conservatory and hanging out with people. And then right before I hit college, I basically got really ill with a horrible stomach issue. I don't want to get too much into,
Yeah.
but I tried to find something that would take up time. And interestingly, it was Paul Thomas Anderson indirectly that got me into Cosmoetica because he did a Thomas Pynchon movie, Inherent Vice,
Oh.
which I wasn't really crazy about. I thought it was well done, but I wasn't really a fan of that movie. But I do respect his filmmaking. And I heard a review, people were talking about how Pynchon was loved and hated in the literature world. Some people loved him, some people hated him. So I basically found you out because I was trying to look up reviews of Thomas Pynchon. And then over time, I just became really involved reading your stuff.
Mm.
And I just became a fan because of the wide variegation of subject material you had on your site.
Okay. All right. Well, so I guess now I'll turn it over for, I don't know how long this first interview goes, 90 minutes, a couple hours, whatever. So, Michael, the show is yours.
All right. So one of the things I really wanted to talk about was sort of both misconceptions. A lot of it has to do with sort of fallacies and misconceptions of art. And I really wanted to talk about the technical definition of art versus what makes art good or bad. Because I was always brought up thinking that good to great art on that scale, so like from 80 to 100, was anything, I always thought I had three criteria. Anything that made you think, anything that was memorable, and anything that was original. And that's where you get a bunch of sort of subjectivity arguments. And you obviously are a big believer, I think, in both. Objectivity probably more than subjectivity. And I kind of wanted to get your opinion on what is the criteria for something great, objectively great.
Well, I mean, throw out originality because, I mean, yes, you can have an original particular take, but, given the fact that human civilization, as far as we know it, and writing particularly, and art in the sense of more than just, painting mammoths on a cave wall, is probably anywhere from 6,000 to 8,000 years old. It's hard to be original. I mean, you can be original in a grand sense, but, if you're going to do a love story or this, that, a crime story, there are going to be certain elements that are going to be there, but it's how you deploy the elements. I mean, think of I don't know if you're gay or straight, but I'm straight. So imagine if I'm imagining Halle Berry or some Hollywood movie star, I can say, well, she has a beautifully shaped nose, she has round eyes, or she has feline eyes, she has a nice what do you call a jawline. She has a figure eight body, and I can take 9 or 10 of these qualities and say, well, there are other women that have just as nice a body, just as nice a jawline, but it's the way they all go together on Halle Berry or whatever starlet you might be interested in that makes her uniquely that person or that image. And it's the same thing in art. You can have, whether it's Moby Dick or before we were recording, we were talking about a few filmmakers like Ingmar Bergman or Yasujiro Ozu. They have certain things that go in to that art form or their art forms, and they do things very well. And but greatness in and of itself is always going to have that element that is ineffable. There's always going to be something that you're missing. And one of the things I've always said to a lot of artists is, when you're studying art and if you want to parse apart a poem or a film scene or a musical phrase or whatnot, to do so is good, but you have to. No, I forgot my mind just went. Uh, what was I saying here now? Geez, forgive me. I just worked a long shift overnight. So what the hell was I just saying? I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, we were talking about art and originality.
Yeah, art and originality, and how to parse apart greatness. Oh God, now I forgot my point. I'm sorry. It'll come to you. Ask me. Well, basically, as far as greatness goes, there's going to be that ineffable quality. That's what I was talking about. The ineffability. Those things that you can't put your finger on. So, for example, if your part, I've always said, to know how to write well, it's better to look at something that's excellent or near great, because when you see the flaw gives you the in to the art, or to the artist. You can say, well, that was almost a great poem, but the reason it didn't do that was because of this flaw. And that's like if you look at a tree knot and you can look inside the tree and you understand, it didn't work because of that. But sometimes when you're engaged with something that's just so stupendously great, let's say you're talking a Rembrandt self-portrait. And I don't know if you've ever seen Rembrandt's self-portraits, but he was one of the first artists that, with both charcoal and with paint, really captured the human visage like it never was captured before. Before Rembrandt, paintings of people, if you look at paintings from the 14 or 1500s, they look more like illustrations. They don't look like real people. Or Rembrandt got that reality. But Rembrandt was so great at it that someone wanting to be the next Rembrandt 50 years later would be like, well, how did he do that? And the same thing with something like Bergman's films, or a novel like Moby Dick at its best. It's difficult to get into it and understand it and break it apart that you would, say, if you were a scientist. So greatness has that thing that is hard to define in some instances. You might be able to define 95% of it, but there's always that one piece or two pieces that bring you back, and every time you engage that piece of art, you are getting something new, and it's because there is that something that is so hard to get. So hopefully that'll suffice as first answer.
Well, but surely individuality and originality is not inherently a good thing, though, because technically speaking, like you could take just saying hypothetically, because obviously Wild Strawberries is that's a fantastic movie. It's a beautiful movie, the Bergman film. I think it was Kubrick's second favorite movie. I think I read somewhere. But let's say hypothetically, who's a bad filmmaker? Like a really bad one did their own version of it. That would be individuality. That wouldn't necessarily mean it was good.
No, but yeah. If you look back, if you were to Google online Dan Schneider and a fellow named Bob Grumman, Grumman, in the early 2000s, this guy was a bad poet. He was actually 24 years older than me to the day, ironically, but he was insane. And if there's a few videos left on him, he was one of these nutty people. And he was so proud of himself for writing this doggerel that he called Mathemacuse, which would be something like he would have words in mathematics. So he would have the square root of my hairy asshole is Descartes' finger. and literally he would have the square root symbol, and he'd have on the one side, finger up my ass and Descartes' asshole or whatever it was. And I remember arguing with him. I said, this is just gimmick poetry, Bob. I mean, you're insane. And I mentioned a poet named Wilfred Watson, who was a Canadian poet who did similar mathematical, but he's like, no, he didn't do that. He did poetry with mine is with words. And that's so much of the art world is filled with gimmicks. people who are just hucksters, but even more so people who are stupendously deluded. So no, originality. I've never particularly valued originality. I mean, it can have some good aspects to it, but more often than not, originality shows the flaws of the writer. But most bad art is generic, and most bad art is unoriginal in the sense that cliches, by their very nature, are defined as cliches by just the mathematical, numerical presence of them, the overwhelming presence of them.
Now, that was something I wanted to ask because I think that's like another fallacy of art. So, the follow my logic here. I think in the back of my mind, this is just a mathematical thing. I constantly envision, something happens and then that's popular, right?
Mhm.
But like, because that's another thing I wanted to bring up was surely can't something just keep becoming cliche? Like if I do something new and people copy that, that would be cliche, correct? Because I
Well,
didn't.
a cliche, cliches generally speaking have an emotional attachment, and one of the things that really kills great art is over emotionalism, melodrama. When we think of bad films, we talk about the tear jerkers. Well, they're melodramas because literally back when the Greeks were doing this stuff, they would have music come up, or well, I shouldn't say the Greek. Maybe the Greeks had it to some extent, but certainly a few hundred years ago, when the Elizabethans were around, bad plays would. Oh, they need that cue, just like a laugh track. Laugh tracks are bad when it comes to situation comedies on television because you don't. If the joke works, you don't need to hear ha 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 ha. And the same thing with melodrama. You don't need to have the music. It's a crutch. And so melodrama is a good example of where you don't need to have that prompting. And what it says is you don't trust the audience to know whether it's good nor bad. And bad art, generally speaking, never trust the audience. If you're trying to be an artist, you always have to write up or make your art for the smartest people out there for this very reason. 99% of people who have ever lived, who are living today, or who ever will live, and let's be, if I'm being optimistic, maybe it'll be 97 or 98% in a few millennia, will never give a shit about art. So art is always being dragged. Art is the epicenter. It's what culture is. Uh, without art, you don't really have culture. You have mathematics, you have some science, you have some politics and whatnot. But the real engine of culture is art, and art is always dragging the other 99% of the uncultured idiots by the back of their hair, like a caveman to his wife, into the future, whether they realize it or not.
Well, that's what's really fascinating. Something I discovered lately. Are you familiar with the Kurt Vonnegut fortune versus misfortune scale?
Now that you mention it, I vaguely recall it, but I don't recall it in detail. Go ahead, explain it.
So for those that don't or who aren't familiar, basically Vonnegut had this scale where he measured cultures' ideas on fortune versus misfortune, and what he found was that there were repeating patterns. It was very mathematical. It wasn't so much of tropes, but it was more mathematical. Like this is a common scale. Like this story of a princess has a fortune, it goes to a misfortune. Mm-hmm. And Vonnegut basically attested that the best stories are stories that are a straight line, where you have to create whether or not it's a good or a bad sort of situation. And I thought that what was it called? I mean, it's a famous one. I was trying to figure it out.
Slaughterhouse Five.
Yeah, that's the one. I read that a long time ago, but from what I remember, I thought Billy Pilgrim. I thought that whole situation, for example, like we're talking about like art and interpretation. I thought that his life, as terrible as it was, I thought that there were some good parts to his life as well. Like he makes money, isn't he? Like
he becomes wealthy. Well, Vonnegut, to put that into different perspective, Vonnegut has one of the best takedowns of someone of Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell with the monomyth and all this stuff. And Vonnegut, I remember seeing an interview maybe 30 years ago on PBS with Vonnegut. He had the best put down ever of Campbell. He said, Oh, that's the guy who spent the whole lifetime figuring out that heroes get into trouble and then get out of trouble.
Well, but that's another thing too, because Campbell is taught everywhere. Like I learned about him in middle school. I learned about him in high school, colleges. I think there was like he may
A
have even
total
done like
fraud, an intellectual fraud.
this is. I'd love to know how so is he a fraud? Like in what way?
Because he states the obvious, and this is what happens with any person who's bullshitting someone. Whether you're a drug dealer, whether you're a fraud, whether you're a televangelist, whether you're a politician, is you give people a little bit of the truth, or you give people a little bit of what they want or think that they know to make them feel good, and then you tell them a lot of shit. Another thing Campbell put on the table was, oh, there are only X amount of stories, 3 types of stories, 7 types of stories, and many people have other come up with other names. It's sort of like people think about gender. You know, there's 127 types of gender or whatnot. First off, as far as stories go, if you're trying to say there's only one story, the hero gets into trouble, out of story, or there's only 5 or 7 or 11 types of stories, you're stupid. Because I can take a story. I've done whole plays where you have a character maybe just sitting and thinking about something, or maybe sees a cricket or a praying mantis out his window, and that generates something. I have a story that I've mentioned a few times in interviews I've done elsewhere and have sent around to people. In one of my books, I have one of my short story books. I have a story called Elements of a Story. And I wrote this because about 7, 8 years ago, a guy who was on my Cosmoetica E-list, whose name I forget, he actually wrote a pretty good little novel, was asking me, how do I write this story or what? And I said, go out, list things that happen, and then think. And so in this Elements of a Story, it starts out with one of my great characters called Bit von Reingold, who's this Jewish dwarf pornographer who appears in several books and whatnot. But after he's doing, the story starts out with him doing a DVD commentary, and then it fades to the woman listening to, a critic listening to it, I think. And we get the speaker of the story talking about something that Jessica and I did when I wrote the story. We went out driving here in Texas, and we saw some geese at a pond. We saw a kid coming out of a driveway with a car. We saw just these very mundane things. So ask yourself questions. How can I make a story out of this? Think about if you ever went to a restaurant. Now with COVID, it's difficult, but you're sitting at a restaurant. You're with your girlfriend or your parents or a bunch of guys you hang out with, and there are 5 of you, and there's 20 other people in the restaurant. 25 people plus the servers, so 30 people. In all of known history, this will be the only time, most likely, the only time that all 25 or 30 of those people are going to be in that restaurant at the same time. Question, how did they get there? All of them have a story. You might have had polio when you were a little kid and spent 3 years rehabbing. I'm going back too many decades, but you might have had some injury that you're rehabbing from. Your best friend may have just broken up with his girlfriend. The waitress that's serving you just had a kid out of wedlock and gave it up for adoption. Just think about these things. Why are people doing what they're doing? In the corner of the restaurant, there's an old man scribbling in a notebook. Is he a poet taking notes for his next poem, even if it's a terrible poem? Or is he just an obsessive compulsive who's lusting after the waitress who's 40 years younger than him because that waitress has a nice ass and he hasn't had ass for 30 years? These are the things that make a story. But this isn't the hero gets into trouble or out of trouble. There's no hero in the story. You don't have to have a hero. I think I sent you my heroic trilogy. If you read those 3 books, the subtitles of those 3 books are the hero, the anti-hero, and the superhero. And I totally that trilogy could be called the Destruction of Joseph Campbell trilogy, because everything that Campbell ever said is basically bullshit, and it's a coin flip as to who has been a more malignant and a more terrible intellectual influence on the arts of the last 40 years, Harold Bloom or Joseph Campbell, because both of them are frauds. Both of them don't know what the fuck they're talking about if you intelligent and you read their writing, it's easy to pick apart. And I think Campbell died before I had Cosmoetica. I think he died about 20 years ago.
He died in, I think, the 80s.
He did. Okay. So, but I know I a few times early on in Cosmoetica, I had contacted Harold Bloom and asked him if he wanted to, talk or debate about it. He wouldn't, because even in just my initial emails, it was obvious he's one of these people who's about himself, and he's not about the interests of something beyond himself. I'm going to make a list. Shakespeare created the human. No, Shakespeare wrote some great plays. He wrote about 7 or 8 great plays out of 37. He wrote about 7 or 8 great sonnets. Maybe you can argue 12, 15, 16 if you're a real Shakespearean out of 154. And his 2 long poems absolutely suck. Is Shakespeare a great writer? Sure. But, I'm not going to be like Mark Twain or anyone saying he wasn't a great writer. But and forget about whether he was gay or not, or whether he was Shakespeare or not. But he also wrote a lot of shit. And if you don't acknowledge that, then you are actually not acknowledging the stuff that was great. Because in order to look at his work, or the work of any artist, you have to be able to say, this worked, that didn't work. This worked 3/4 of the way and failed in a quarter. A quarter of it has issues of some sort. And so when you deal with a Howard Bloom or Campbell, they're just such bullshitters and frauds.
Thank you. I mean that really, like I said, you were probably one of the first critics that's like really smart that like decimated him, and I love to know about that. I mean, and it's interesting to me because I always thought that it's not so much because, okay, I'll give you a good example. I was watching an amazing movie the other day, Mirror by Tarkovsky.
Oh yeah,
right?
Yeah,
that's a great movie.
Probably his best.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm like my favorite's probably Stalker, but that's like a subjective, personal favorite. Yeah. Objectively, I think Mirror's his best. Objectively,
yeah.
And that's like a movie that's it's not like a hero cycle or any of that bullshit. I always assumed that great stories were not first off not hero. I don't want to say that. I always thought great art or great stories was human being gets challenged. That's what I always assumed. I thought that's what made a great story. A person has a developed worldview, and then that gets challenged, and then we see their development. That's what I always thought made a good story. And I'm curious if you agree with that posit or
not. To a certain degree, there's a movie by Robert Bresson called O Hussar Balthazar, which is about the life and death of a donkey. And the donkey is the main character, and he goes through 4 or 5 main vignettes in a 2-hour movie, has some owners, and we see the sufferance of this donkey. And at the end of the movie, it seems like he's about to die, but the movie ends before he actually dies. Well, that's a great film. And if you watch it, art really, I have said, translates reality, translates the cosmos. If you are reading Moby Dick, or you're watching a Bresson or a Bergman film, or Akira Kurosawa, who is a fabulous filmmaker, you watch something and you can watch a Kurosawa movie that's a comedy about these dopey Japanese idiots from 800 years ago, and you learn something about the human element. You learn something about humor. You learn something about how people interact with each other, and that gives you an insight in how to live better. Great art and, for example, great literature teaches you to read better, and if you can read better, then you can think better. And if you can think better, then you can make decisions better, whether they're which lever to pull for whatever candidate or party that you're supporting, or whether you're going to go to a church, or going to be an atheist or an agnostic, or whether you're going to do this, that, is this girl who makes your heart flutter, is she the one that you want to spend your life with? You make decisions better when you know how to think. And art makes you think. This is one of the reasons why the idea of art as a primarily emotional engagement is wrong. Because think about anything that you've watched. Ingmar Bergman. Bergman doesn't move me emotionally, not in an immediate sense.
Really?
but I can watch a movie like The Virgin Spring. I don't know if have you watched The Virgin Spring?
I have not.
Okay, there's a great scene, and it's not one of his better films, where Max von Sydow, one of his main character actors, is playing a knight whose daughter has been raped and killed, and he goes to the spring, the brook where his daughter was killed, and he's looking down on it, and the camera is back maybe about 25, 30 feet from him, and all we see is this knight with his back turned, and we see his body slowly slumping. We don't see his face. We don't see his eyes. We don't hear his crying. This is not a Hollywood movie. But in the slow slump of his body, this powerful man whose daughter has been brutalized and killed, we get that we know. We know what he's going through. And that is an emotional moment that maybe not is not going to affect you right away like a tearjerker film might, some rom-com, but you're going to remember that moment long after you've even forgotten the name of that rom-com because of the way it's presented, the way that it slowly seeps into you, and it gets in through your mind because you're saying, why did I saw that movie 3 weeks ago. I can't get that scene out of my mind. Why is that? But what touches you intellectually will inevitably seep down into the emotions because the intellect is what makes us human. It's not emotions. I was coming across a woman I once knew, and she's one of these people that love is the only thing that matters. Bullshit. My cats can love. Animals can love. But animals cannot create art. Animals do not create the Great Pyramids. Animals do not send other animals to the moon. Animals do not contemplate, look in the mirror and say, what am I? Why am I here? What is this thing called reality? Animals can't do that. Humans have the intellect to do that. And there are intelligent animals, crows and whales and apes and whatnot, but they're not in our league. Now, that has its problems because intellect, the more complex something gets, the more can go wrong. So you don't have animals that's totally psychopathic as some of our leads. Yes, you have chimpanzees and other animals that are violent, but not deliriously violent the way we are. But anyway, it is the intellect that art is primarily intellectual intercourse. It is communication at its highest level.
So, okay, let me put it to you this way then. If I watch two movies of equal intelligence, like let's say they're just stellar, super thought-provoking movies, but the one smart one, they're both smart, but one of them gets me emotional, is that inherently a better piece of art, though?
It depends. I mean, look, there's no hard and fast rules. I mean, you can have general principles rather than ticky-tacky little rules or whatnot. So many. Another woman that I was once hot for years ago. I saw about a year or so ago. She's trying to write her first novel, and she has these photos where she's plotting out on her kitchen wall. Chapter 13. This is where I have to introduce the hero because, well, and it's like this is a terrible way to write. This is why things are so formulaic. You have to engage art, engage life organically. There has to be a certain simulacrum of reality in the art that you can emotionally and especially intellectually connect with. That's what connects. If you have, I'm repeating myself if you've watched any of these many videos, but it's far more important to get behind a character's eyes than to know what color their eyes are. Who gives a shit whether I've got blue eyes or not? But what do my eyes see? Do I notice that little praying mantis that just ripped apart, an ant colony and is feeding on the ants? Do I notice that fat woman who no one looks at in the park sitting on a bench? Do I read a story about, say, a black kid who was just recently killed in February by these two racist motherfuckers down in whatever Yahoo southern town they are, or not? Or do I just go, oh yeah, another black guy killed in America, a big deal, pass the popsicle. These are the things that define who I am more so than, I'm a 50 excuse me, not COVID, not COVID, but just a little individual sneeze. But those are the things that define me more so than the fact that I wear eyeglasses or have blue eyes or have thinning blonde hair or have pale skin lacking melanin or am half Norwegian. Those are just the footnotes to who I am. But what I am essentially is an ephemeral thing, because every atom in my body is going to be replaced between every 4.5 to 7 years. And when I'm dead, the only thing that's going to be Dan Schneider is the writing. And maybe some of these videos that you can see in 50 or 500 or 5,000 years, if they last that long. These are the only things. And one of the reasons I do these videos is so that someone in 5,000 years looking back at me and saying, boy, it's so good that of all the ancients, like Homer and Dante and Schneider, I can actually see what Schneider was like, because in the long span of history, the 2,000 years or so difference between me and Homer is going to be minimal to someone in 10,000 years.
Well, it's interesting because I think a quote like that was said in the third Vonnegut book. I don't know if you've ever read Mother Night.
Yes, but years ago. I've read all Vonnegut, but it's been many years.
Because I want to say I read that last September. I vaguely recall they made a comment in there like the only thing left of us will be art, something along those lines. And what you just said kind of reminded me of that.
And art can transcend things too. There's a big problem with modern society and how to pass on information. Up in in an island north of Norway called Svalbard, this was called the seed chamber. That in case we nuked ourselves, or mankind went extinct or virtually extinct, the seeds of all of our major grains are stored in this granary underground in Svalbard, this island. And one of the things that they have a difficulty doing is, how do they let people know in 5,000 or 10,000 years after said apocalypse happens that that's where it is, and that they could go down there and, oh, here are grains that you can grow these types of fruits and one, because they're freeze dried, they could last 20,000 years. And the same thing with nuclear waste dumps. How do we tell someone in 10,000 years that this is radioactive and you could die if you go into this area? Or something like Chernobyl. How do you set up? Because 10,000 years ago, there was all of the languages that we have now. We didn't even have the proto languages. Much less Middle English or Old English. That's only in the last 1,000 years. So developing communication beyond that language barrier has always been difficult. Now, art can do that to a certain degree. If you're doing film, or without words, you can convey certain things that obviously I can't in writing. On the other hand, writing, I can go much more interior than you can filmically. But that's a big problem, and how to the communication thing goes.
So it's interesting because really one of the things I really learned from Cosmoetica is emotion needs to be a byproduct of art. If you're like a good example would be Kubrick movies, because I feel like people have often accused him of being emotionless.
Yeah.
But if you watch like his films, like Clockwork Orange, I felt really bad for Alex. Even though this guy's a horrible person, I felt horrible that the guy was getting tortured. Or same thing with Space Odyssey, which people say is cold and boring. But I actually really felt for those characters.
I felt for Hal. First time I saw 2001 in 76 or 77, I remember watching it late night on a Friday or Saturday night when they would have the movie of the week. This is long before you were born, probably. And I remember thinking to myself, the scene where Hal gets lobotomized by pulling out the red cones or whatnot, I felt bad. I started tearing up, because even though Hal, we don't know why he's malfunctioned, and later retcons and later books say he didn't malfunction, he was programmed that way. But I felt bad for him because he seemed to be a sentient being. And even though he did some bad things, he was basically being slowly killed. And how you can say that wasn't emotional, I don't know. I remember Jessica and I saw this idiot on YouTube ripping into Kubrick, saying, well, here's the beginning of 2001. We see the lions, and all we get is landscape. And then we get more landscape. And it's like, this guy's an idiot. I mean, but the world is filled with idiots in real life, online, whatnot. I try to ignore it.
Well, I think the biggest problem is people feel like they have to have solidified opinions, and there's no objectivity. Like, like there is objectivity, but I feel like people get so insular, like so closed-minded with their views. I feel like they have to have this set in stone opinion on stuff. Like, like I might personally not like something, but I know objectively it's great. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the beginning of Space Odyssey, there's that whole thing with the apes, and it's one of the most memorable things is the tribalism that we see. I felt really bad when he got the shit beat out of him.
Yeah.
So we were talking about how art is an intellectual thing and how people, but this is something that this is a really important thing to bring up though. What's the difference between somebody like a Kubrick who's genuinely thought-provoking, who wants us to think, versus like a hack, like a pseudo-intellectual who's like, well, you haven't dug deeper enough to see into my vision. Like, what's the difference between a Kubrick and somebody who's like manipulative and makes you think you're too stupid for not getting it?
Simple quality. I mean, and now what makes that quality? Well, the depth of it, how it's portrayed. Think of. Let me think. What movie would be a good example? Well, take a comedy like Dr. Strangelove.
I love that movie.
Now,
my favorite.
Yeah, now that's an intelligent comedy, and I like funny Three Stooges shorts, but I can't compare. If I take the funniest Three Stooges short ever, whatever that might have been, and even go beyond the Three Stooges. Let's say Groucho Marx and the Marx Brothers. I take the best Marx Brothers film, and I think Groucho Marx was one of the absolute comic geniuses of all time. I would love to have interviewed Groucho Marx, but he died when I was 12. But the best Marx Brothers movie still doesn't come close to Dr. Strangelove for the fact that it doesn't have the intellectual content. It doesn't have the social content. It doesn't have the political content. It doesn't have the layers of depth that contrast society and the individual, free will versus destiny, and these things. That's not to say that a Marx Brothers movie is devoid of intellectual content. It is not, and mostly it's because of Groucho Marx, because he was so brilliant. But it's not the same thing. So the difference between, say, a Steven Spielberg and a Stanley Kubrick is if you look at any Kubrick, any Spielberg movie, whether it's Saving Private Ryan or Schindler's List, or going
Which
back.
I think is your least favorite. I think you really hated Schindler's List, from what I understand.
I didn't hate it; it's just bad. I mean, I don't waste. I'm not going to waste something on it. But you know what's going to happen if I know what's going to happen, and it happens. You wasted my time because I could figure it out. I'll give you an example. What really does anger me though is about, I guess it must have been 18 years ago. There was a movie, I think, with Johnny Depp called, it was a movie about Jack the Ripper.
I know what you're talking about. Sweeney Todd?
No, not Sweeney Todd. But anyway, it In Blood. Let me go. No, hold on. Let me just ask my wife. Hey, Jess, what was the name of that Jack the Ripper movie that sucked? What? From Hell. Yeah, there was a movie called From Hell. So Jess and I went to see this about a year or so before we moved to Texas. And I remember thinking it was a pretty damn good movie, about 75% of the way in. And then what happened? Well, then it became stupid as fuck, and the supposed Jack the Ripper, his eyes turned black. And we went from a pretty good historical psychological drama about a very trite subject, but it was well made up till that point, and then it went all fucking stupid. Another movie that really pissed me off was Steven Spielberg's, what was the one with Tom Cruise and Minority Report, yeah. And for 3/4, 80% of that movie, it's much better than Philip K. Dick. And Philip K. Dick, I could spend an hour talking about how fucking bad he was, but every adaptation of anything Dick is better than the original. But Spielberg gives a real. It was probably up until the 80% mark, arguably the best film that Spielberg ever made, and then that went stupid too, and it became all predictable. And it's like, what the fuck are you doing? You know,
Do you,
you what? Go ahead.
I was gonna say, do you think that's because Spielberg, at the end of the day, is about money and he's just about the entertainment factor?
No,
So he can't.
it's because he's a sentimentalist and he values emotion over intellect. And I think Steven Spielberg probably, if you talk to him, is a fairly intelligent guy, but he knows fuck about art. He really does. I mean, he should be a cameraman. He should be a cinematographer. He's got a great eye. But just like Spike Lee has a great eye. But Spike Lee and Steven Spielberg should not be filmmakers because they don't know what a story is about. If you're going to tell a story, you have to have characters that you can connect with. You have to take people into an area that's interesting, that gives you something to chew on intellectually. But if all you're going to do is in Saving Private Ryan is, oh, here's a bunch of cliches. Here's the bland hero in Hanks. Oh, here's the Italian kid. Here's the Jew. Here's the Irish guy who's battling alcoholism or whatever. Here's the asshole who thinks he's going to save the day and fucks everyone up. When you have nothing but a plenum of cliches, what the fuck is the point? You don't have that in Mirror. If you look at Mirror, you are constantly, and whether you're watching for the first or the 10th or the 21st time,
I watched it twice, and I still have to watch it again and again.
Right.
But it's like
you never have to watch a Spielberg movie twice. That watching a Spielberg movie twice is like trying to wipe your asshole with the toilet paper you just used. What's the sense of just putting your shit back on your ass?
I'm sorry. That was a that was a great analogy. But no, well, actually, real quickly before I go back, and I don't want to like talk about Spielberg too much, but just more generally.
Yeah.
Real quickly, what did you think of the poetry in Mirror as a poet yourself?
Again, I don't have off the top of my head. I don't. I mean, were there poems in it, or are we talking the poesy of the film itself?
I remember there were poems narrating the movie.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'd have to. The closest thing that I can remember, the best narration of some of the early Malick films. I don't have it in me. I mean, if we were watching the movie together, I could say, "Oh, notice how this interacts with the with the image, and we get a schism there that brings you back to that moment." When we are 45 minutes later into the film, it'll recur. I don't, off the top of my head, I can't do that. Sorry.
No problem. I mean, there's so much art out there. I mean, you're bound to forget some of it. But what I was trying to say earlier was, it's interesting. Are you familiar with the Terry Gilliam clip talking about Spielberg and Schindler's List?
I know that Terry Gilliam, I think, is not too thrilled with Spielberg as an artist, and Gilliam is a much better filmmaker overall. But if I saw it years ago.
Basically, he made a comment about how he feels like Spielberg movies wrap everything in a bow. Like, we saved the day, the Holocaust, we won because we saved like 5 people or whatever. And it's interesting because he said that Kubrick, this is the quote by Kubrick, he said, the problem with Schindler's List is it's about success. But in real life, the Holocaust is about tragedy. Supposedly Kubrick absolutely hated it. He thought it was just childish, Yeah. And
I've always been suspicious of Spielberg's claims that they were buddies because that's like me hanging around with Joey the dog-faced boy who barks when the moon comes out. It's like, yeah, here Joey, here's a biscuit, but I can't have any intellectual intercourse with Joey because he's the pinhead. And I'm sorry, but Spielberg is not in any league with Kubrick. Kubrick is one of the top 5 or 6 filmmakers. He's up there with Kurosawa and Bergman and Orson Welles. And Spielberg is, the dumb little shit in the back fingering his asshole,
Well, no, I mean, it's amazing to me. I mean, like, Kubrick was just a genius. I would say Kubrick probably had one of the best, consistently good filmographies up till he died, even with Eyes Wide Shut. I saw that a long time ago, but I remember being wowed by it. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I when I saw it, I was like, this is clearly a great film, and yet all the critics were saying it wasn't. Then 15 years go by, and they're saying the same things that I said. But most of these, this is why most critics I mean, people are such sheeple, whether they're fucking people voting. Uh, I'm not going to vote third party because I want to vote Democrat and Republican, so my vote counts, even though I'm going to get raped up the ass. People are the same way with criticism of film. They don't want to say something is bad right away because and my wife is just telling me that she was reminding me of a friend of ours who was once given a book for free to review, and the person who wrote the book was complaining to Jessica about when she was writing for this website why the review wasn't in, and the guy who got the book said that, well, it was a bad book and I didn't want to write a negative review. That's not the point. You said you were going to review it, and you have to take a stand. You know, there's no, if I say that Steven Spielberg is a bad filmmaker, I'm not saying he's a bad human being. I'm not saying Spike Lee is a bad human being.
Yeah, that's what drives me crazy is that if you tell somebody, like, if you think someone's a bad artist and they're a fan, they take it personally.
Yeah.
But it's like, I don't think less of somebody because they like, unless they're like into really bad stuff. Yeah. I don't think less of somebody. Like, okay, I'll give you a good example, right? And because everyone gets so offended, left or right. I mean, I've met so many people that get easily offended. So I love John Steinbeck, right? I know you love Grapes of Wrath. Are you familiar with his other stuff?
Well, let's stop using, if you can, let's stop using emotional terms. I can tell you things okay. I love. I love Godzilla films, but I appreciate intellectually Steinbeck. There are some moments like the Rose of Sharon incident at the end where she feeds the the hobo with her breast milk. You know, that's a great scene, and I love certain elements of it. But it's because of the greatness of how it's crafted and where it's placed at the end. But you know, like I said, if I just had 90 minutes before I was to die and I was in a room and they said, "Can you play one movie that you want to watch?" I'd say play Godzilla's Revenge with Minya, because that emotionally got to me. I was a latchkey kid. I was bullied like that. I fought back, often futilely, and sometimes I would win. And that's actually a great kids movie if you've ever read my review of it. And it's totally slagged on by Godzilla snobs as a bad film because it uses pieces of other Godzilla films from the 60s which were cheesy. But if you actually look at it, it's a film about a lonely kid basically trying to avoid criminals, bullies, and a possible pedophile.
Yeah, but okay. So, but going back to my main point, do you think Steinbeck? Have you read any of his other work, and do you think highly of it as an artist?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've read everything. Like I've read Travels with Charlie. I've read The Pearl and
East of Eden.
What? Yeah, East of Eden. Yeah, certainly. I've read East of Eden. I've read. I mean, I probably read, if he's got 25 novels or something, I probably read 18 to 19 of them. And I think he's a consistently excellent writer with probably 5 or 6 novels you can argue is great. Certainly, I think The Grapes of Wrath is the big book. It's his Moby Dick. I don't think it's as great as Moby Dick, but it's his masterpiece.
The reason I brought him up was to give you an example. Like, supposedly, I was reading an article about like what Steinbeck liked, because it always fascinates me who likes other stuff as an artist. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I read somewhere that Steinbeck said he liked Hemingway short stories. He emphasized Hemingway short stories, and then William Faulkner. But like, and I'm not a fan of Faulkner. He gives me a headache. I tried reading Pylon, the one about airplanes. It was just he goes on for like. I mean, his long sentences are just exhausting, and I don't have a problem with that, but it's just not my thing. But here's the thing. I don't think less of Steinbeck because he liked Faulkner. And I feel like a lot of people have this idea like, oh, you think less of them or whatever if you don't like the art they like. Does that make sense? Basically, but yeah, like we were talking about, like, that's what people take offense to is like whether or not like you like something or you think less of it because of whatever. But I am curious though. What do you think about Hemingway though as a writer?
His short stories are better than his novels. I would agree with Steinbeck there. The Kilimanjaro one. I mean, he had that little rat-a-tat-tat-tat short story. A sentence structure. The thing with Hemingway is probably his best overall work is Old Man and the Sea because it's short and to the point. I don't think Hemingway was a particularly deep human being, and I don't think he was a particularly deep writer, because the more that he spoke or the more that he wrote on characters, the duller they became. Um, that's just having now probably been 10 or 12 years removed from reading any substantial Hemingway. That's the memory that I have of Hemingway.
Well, I was going to say because I mean, you're a poet yourself, and you write beautifully. And I was going to ask, do you think that Hemingway's style is considered boring? Because I've talked to some people that think he's just monotonous and dry, and I didn't know what you felt about
That
that.
it depends on the quality. The quality makes it. You this gets back. People want to lump everything together, just like with Joseph Campbell and stories. Like I said, show me a great Shakespeare sonnet, and I'll say that's a great sonnet. Show me one of his shittier sonnets, that's a fifth-rate knockoff. I mean, one of the problems with Shakespeare, if you actually read all 154 sonnets, for example, you'll have a handful of sonnets that deal with this topic or that topic, and usually there's a range of quality. There's the best one, there's the worst one, and there's the mediocre one. And I don't know whether he wrote the best one first and the worst one last, or in what chronological order they were written in. But it depends on the quality, and there is no, if I'm reading, for example, some of the early mediocre and trite poetry of W.B. Yeats, and then I'm reading some of the stuff he wrote in the last 15, 20 years of his life, well, the good stuff, the great stuff, is in that last 15 or 20 years mostly, and the bad stuff is in the beginning. So to say that I'm moved by Yeats's poetry, no, I'm moved, if I'm moved emotionally, by the quality of the writing. And it's going to vary from poem to poem, from book to book, from painting to painting. It depends. The idea of the monomyth by Kant. There is no monolithic. To go back to Kubrick in 2000, there is no monolithic art. If you read all of Schneider, Dan Schneider, or all of my wife Jessica's work, there's going to be things that you're going to connect with more than the others. One of the reasons I feel compelled to write about many different things, and to write poems and essays and reviews and short stories and novels and now plays, is because I want people to have a wide variety. And there are going to be things that they say, yeah, I think Dan is a great writer or something, but his poetry moves me more than his plays, or his long novels move me more than his short stories, or vice versa. Well, that's fine. I'm not there to that you need to like me, whether I'm alive or dead. I'm not that insecure. I'm here and creating art, and any artist of any salt is there making the art so that the recipient of the art can understand something, can get something of utility to use in their life. And it may emotionally move them. It may not. Art doesn't have to be beautiful, for example. That's one of the most noxious cliches. Art is beauty. What are you, a fucking 3-year-old? What are you, a fucking 3-year-old? Art has to... No. A lot of art can be ugly. Art can be hard. It can be convoluted. But does it get to the core of something of depth? Something that, again, gets you into what is this life about? And not just the human life. Because, and this is something I've said many times, in 10,000 years, 10,000 light years away, I would love for an alien being to plug into the Encyclopedia Galactica or whatnot, pull up an ancient Earth art and stumble upon a poem of mine or a short story or whatever it is and say, that ancient creature, how the fuck did he know that, since he never left his planet? And whatever it is that creature thinks that I knew about existential woes of being whizzing through the Andromeda galaxy or whatnot, I don't know what that might be, but that connects me, and that is, to me, far more important as a symbol of immortality than just living forever. I don't want to live forever. I mean, I can barely remember now in 55 years things that happened last Tuesday. What am I going to do if I was 5,500 years old or 5.5 million years old? I mean, these kinds of things are just the hubris that a lot of artists have. I want someone to open up and read something and say, I got that, and thank God that I read Schneider's sonnets. Say,
Yeah, I mean but that actually brings me to a different point, which is the fallacy: art is the truth. And I
oh
wanted to ask
yeah,
you about that. What do you mean? Because I
art
think
is artifice. What does artifice mean? Artificial. It's not the truth. It cannot be the truth. It cannot be. And this is one of the things people confuse is truth and reality. Reality is what is. I am here in this moment Skyping with a guy named Michael Gangone, and that is the reality. Now, whatever truth you might want to say about that, is going to be subjective. I mean, truth truly is subjective. When people say, I want to speak, I want to give, power to my truth. Well, I understand what they mean. But when they conflate, what they really are talking about, what truth really is, what people think truth is reality. Reality doesn't give a flying fuck about you or me or about what's true or untrue or whatnot. Reality simply is. End of story. And this is the thing that vexes people because they want to think that if I'm an artist, that makes me a better person. No, it doesn't. There are a lot of scumbag artists. Yeah, Rilke was not a particularly good person, but I don't care. We were talking about bad people or good people. Spielberg is a bad filmmaker, but he's probably a better person than Roman Polanski, who's a rapist. Even though his family was killed in the Holocaust or whatnot, he still had some sick urge to try to find. And the girl he actually did rape is probably not the only one he ever did. But there's something wrong with him. I wouldn't want to hang out with Roman Polanski, but if I had an opportunity to Skype with him and talk to him about film technique, I can separate that. You know, uh, but people think that if I'm a poet, that means I'm a good person. And people want to be accepted. We're social animals. So we want to daisy chain and yank each other's cranks as we're passing around the bananas in our little circle jerk. But that doesn't do anything of any value for anyone who can't be in that circle jerk.
Well, that's what's really fascinating to me is that I read a New York Times article about I think there was a composer who was Jewish and he was conducting music by Richard Wagner.
Oh,
Wagner.
sin.
Well, you know what he said? This is really amazing. He said Wagner never composed one racist note of music.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then that's the thing about art. It doesn't. I always thought that great art doesn't matter as long as the art is great. It can apply to anybody.
Yeah. Look, I've said a similar thing. Suppose in some archive in Vienna, where I believe Hitler studied painting or whatnot, it turned out that Hitler wasn't only a mediocre painter, and he wasn't a terrible painter like people said. If you want, he was certainly a competent painter. But let's say he also wrote some poems. And Hitler was too fucked up to realize he had more talent in poetry. Both Stalin and Mao wrote poetry, but they were not good poets. But let's say Hitler was maybe not Rilke great, but let's say he was at the level of a good, solid, competent poet like, what's his name? The guy, uh, Mark Van Doren. Mark Van Doren is one of the most solid, excellent poets you're going to find. But he never really wrote anything that is unadulteratedly great. Maybe one or two things you could argue were great, but his poems were consistently good. Let's say Hitler was a consistently good poet. Does this mean that if I say, Hitler in his rediscovered folio of 83 sonnets was actually a pretty good poet? You're a fucking Jew hater, Dan. Where do you get that? Where do you get that? Because they are two absolutely separate domains. Because I say Rilke was a great poet doesn't mean that I support the fact that he was a lousy father and an unfaithful spouse. Because I say that Einstein came up with great physical equations does not mean that I support the fact that he was again a bad father and a terrible husband. But people they people have to put in boxes, and they don't think well. And this is what great art can do: is it's not going to make every idiot that says things like that intelligent, but you might get one or two out of 500 people and switch them. And to me, that's worth it.
Well, one of the other fallacies that I see where bad people defend, or it's not bad people, but like I should say, people defend bad art is they say stuff like, "Oh, it's not made for you." I'm sure you've heard that before, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, because if I read Maya Angelou's Doggerel and I'm not a black woman, I just don't get it. No, I get it because there's the common currency. If we remove Maya Angelou's name and we just look at the words on the page, it's Doggerel. It's fucking Hallmark card level writing. And that's not going to change if instead of Maya Angelou, it's Saul Rabinowitz and he's a Jewish janitor who wrote those poems. It's not going to change if it's, Molly Fleener from fucking Dublin who wrote that. It's not going to change if it's Wang Fu Wang from some Chinese province who wrote that. It's still Doggerel because ultimately it has to stand by itself. When I'm dead and this flesh sack of 170 pounds of flesh, blood, and shit that goes around with the moniker Dan Schneider is long gone, only the words are going to remain. And people in 10,000 years who look at it, they're not going to give a flying fuck was Dan molested or not? Was Dan a Republican or a Democrat? There's not going to be Republicans or Democrats. Was Dan this, that, or the other thing? Who gives a fuck? The only thing that's going to matter about Dan Schneider is the words.
Well, that's where it really becomes an interesting part of the art is what is worth making a piece of art about. You know what I mean? Like, because there's obviously cliche stuff. There's obviously stuff that gives you false empowerment, as I say. But what about like genuine art? That's like, okay, let me rephrase that. What's the difference between art that's like about how shitty life is, that's great, it's like brutal, versus art that's just like bitchy and whiny? I don't know
I mean, again, it's quality. It's how do you get there? I'll give you an example. I just finished a 5-play run on King Arthur, the Arthurian mythos, and I redid it all, and it's fucking great. I mean, it's probably it is to my plays, and I've written 64 plays so far. Uh, it is the capstone right now to the plays. So the next play I'm doing, which I'm gathering, is going to be on Sargon of Akkad. I'm doing the great plays, which is going to be Sargon the Great, Cyrus the Great, and Alexander the Great, all 3 BC guys who founded empires and whatnot. And so I don't know ultimately what my Sargon play is going to be about, but I know Sargon interests me, and I looked up information on him, on his family, and I'm creating a family drama. I have an idea where it's going to go, and part of the fun, and you have to have fun if you're going to create art, because so many people who are artists are miserable. Oh, it drains me so much. Then don't do it, you fucking idiot. You should enjoy doing it, but I don't know where it's going to go, and that's one of the things that's interesting. But I do know I have a handle, and the characters of Sargon and his family are coming alive to me, and that's the thing that's exciting. That's the thing that pushes me forward. And what you can get from it, or what that person in 10,000 years, or that creature flying around in the Andromeda galaxy who stumbles upon something of mine in 10,000 years will get from it, I don't know. But if they get something, and they get something meaningful, that's the thing that matters. It doesn't, what I intend, I've called this the intentional fallacy, and I've talked about the divine inspiration fallacy. What I intend, what any artist, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Papa Hemingway was chugging Pepto-Bismol because he had an ulcer or something, and this is what inspired him to write Old Man in the Sea. What does it matter? What I mean, again, this is trivia. This is footnote, and this is one of the bad things about biographers and these would-be hagiographers and myth makers is that this shit doesn't matter, and they don't realize it. But we live in such a navel-gazing culture that we equate. Imagine if Andrei Tarkovsky's personal life were treated like Beyonce Knowles's. Now, I'm sure Beyonce Knowles is a nice enough person. She's a beautiful woman. She's a good singer or whatnot. But Beyonce Knowles is not an artist in the league with Andrei Tarkovsky. And it's not because she's a black woman that I say that. It's because she's a pop artist. You can't compare her trivial little pop songs about shaking her booty and whatnot with Tarkovsky's 4 or 5 greatest films. And to do so is to diminish not only Tarkovsky and not only great art, but the recipient. It's saying that there's no difference between the result and the effort that a great artist put in versus that's tossed off by someone, in some hip hop way. Now I can appreciate pop up. Before we were doing this interview, I for some reason came to mind a rock singer named Jizzy Pearl from a band called Love Hate, and I googled him and I saw a couple of years ago he released this rock song on YouTube, and it's a damn good rock song. He was 60 years old when he did it, and he's better than most rock artists today. But again, it's just a pop song. But I can appreciate that he was and still is a great rock pop singer. But again, I can't compare him to Bergman or Tarkovsky, and to do so would not only diminish Tarkovsky and Bergman, but it would be absurd, and it would take away from the minor bit of greatness that Jizzy Pearl or Beyonce Knowles have as pop singers. And people don't get this because everything has to be equal. Everything is not equal. Okay, I cannot outplay LeBron James in basketball. I can't outskate Alexander Ovechkin, the hockey player. I can't play chess like whoever the grandest chess master is now, but they can't write a sonnet like me. They can't write a novel like I wrote, A Norwegian in the Family, almost 2.5 million words. They can't do that. And to try to equate these things is to not only diminish the greater achievement, but even the lesser achievement. And people don't get this because they don't think.
So so a good thing love to talk about is so one of my favorite novels is Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Like every chapter is beautiful and it says something about humanity. But it's interesting to me because technically it's not like an exciting book, like in terms of like crazy stuff happening. It's just a beautiful novel about living life. I felt so bad for Johnny Nolan. I love this little Francie Nolan. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
So why does this person? I really didn't like this other book. What was it called? To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf.
Yeah.
Why doesn't something like that? In other words, why is somebody who has like a quote unquote boring life? Why can somebody write about it and it's meaningful? Why is that meaningful if someone has a boring life compared to somebody else who doesn't have an exciting life, but the writing's boring? Like, what's the difference between quality about something, that's quote unquote boring versus something?
I don't know why Betty Smith was better at wordplay, at least in that novel. My wife Jessica's read 2 or 3 of her other books. I unfortunately have not. She says that they're good, competent, but Tree Grows in Brooklyn is by far Betty Smith's best book. I'll take Jessica at her claim on that. But why is she better than who was the one? Virginia Woolf. She's just better with words. Virginia Woolf is trite. Virginia Woolf didn't do anything new. Virginia Woolf is one of these artists apparently that's so striving. I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to be an artist and want to just fucking write. Stop with. I don't write a poem. I don't write anything to declare and pat myself on the back. Now, if I tell you that I'm a great poet or I'm a great novelist or a great critic or whatnot, I can back that up. I can back that, and I could argue it from then to time. But you know what? There's the old saying, you can't argue with an idiot. I think Mark Twain said it. Mark Twain, Groucho Marx, and Oscar Wilde. You could just go through the quotations of those 3 guys and never have to quote anyone else, basically. But anyway.
But it's interesting to me because I'm reading Tumbleweeds right now. I'm on page 56, and we switch perspectives in that book. And you go from Manny. Is that based on you at all?
Well, yeah. Manny Cole is my alter ego throughout the whole 4-book New York quartet.
Which is not Danny Wagner. That's your other alter ego.
Wagner. He's American.
Okay.
Yeah, but they're two. Manny Cole is sort of the. I mean, let me just say, I have several alter egos in my poems. I have three poems that are called the Kevin poems, and it's about a black kid in the 1960s. So Kevin was my first poetic alter ego. Then I have Manny Cole, who's in the New York Quartet. I have Henry Matsumi, a Japanese-American boy who appears in a number of my short stories and in my book, The Scorpion Swam. He's also one of my alter egos. Then there's Dan Schneider himself, who's in True Life, my True Life memoirs, who's Dan Schneider, but again, it's a memoir, so it's not totally 100% me. Then there's Danny Wagner, who's in these plays. So,
well, I was gonna say it's interesting because your characters seem to make observations about stuff. Like I'm on right now the fire ants page. I think it's from the black kid's perspective, and you're like with ants. It's interesting because I don't want to say if that's like memoir like. I don't know if that's like a right word to describe it. But it seems to me that your characters like to observe very specific things, and then like that's what says a lot about society. Am I right or wrong? I don't know how I can articulate that.
there are different characters that have different ways of being. I mean, my characters generally are going to be more in touch with things than your average person. But that's because your average person is a fucking sheeple. That's not to say that you couldn't write. I mean, I've got some pretty clueless characters. If you get around to Vincetti Brothers and then A Norwegian the Family, I have this guy Tony Luft who's a killer, and Tony Luft is a pretty clueless fuck, but he's funny. But it's pretty dull to why would you want to write about characters that are clueless unless you're going to use that in some larger scheme to bring something out.
Well, yeah, well, okay, so, like, I'll put it to you this way, like, you have Wub, Chubby William, correct?
Yeah.
So, like, could you imagine, and obviously he's supposed to be the dumb one, but I'm saying, like, he's not, like, okay, could you imagine doing an entire book based off of Wub's mindset, or would you not do that? Because it seems to me so far, he seems to have a function in the greater story, but could you ever do, like, a story just about somebody who's an idiot like that? Like
I have stories about people who are fairly idiot. I have one of my early novels was about a guy who's a pedophile who's reading a science fiction book and trying to equate his pedophilia with some kind of sexual freedom that he's do. I have a book based upon a couple of years where I worked as a janitor, and the characters are all pretty fucking stupid, other than the janitor. Again, it's how you frame things. It's you can have clueless characters. The last novel I wrote in the last 3 years, I've written 64 plays and 2 novels, and so. The last book that I did was about this girl who was the main character, who was married to a real professional wrestler called Gorgeous George. And she alternates between being utterly fucking clueless and having these sort of accidental moments of insight. And that's what often happens is, you can find, you have, in my book, I use a term about writing total immersion, and I came upon this while writing my second book, Vincetti Brothers. To a certain degree, it's in Tumbleweeds, but the second book of the quartet, which was written 6 years later, Tumbleweeds, is where I really get into this total immersion. In total immersion, you can have 2 characters talking for 10 pages about something that's probably not that deep, but the point of it is not the subject that they're talking about, but how they're talking about it. And I use this example. Next time, after this COVID stuff is gone and people don't have to social distance, the next time you're at a bar or you're at a ball game and you're watching a game, take a look at how the sexes interact with each other within sex. When women are talking, you will see the women will look at each other eye to eye. And they'll be engaged, and they'll be like, girl, I just want to tell you that Jonathan, he was a real son of a bitch. He did this to me. He did that. Oh, girl, I get you. I get you, girl. Oh, I know. Bobby, he was even worse to me. And they will connect eye to eye. Now take a look at when men talk. men, you've heard the term man spreading?
Yeah, where they,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, the balls are
yeah.
out.
So,
Okay.
so men, when they want to talk deep to each other, they don't look eye to eye because there's the testosterone thing. There's the thing, who's going to flinch first? Men will sit side by side like they're in the bleachers watching a baseball game, and they'll be looking out into the ether because women are about tactile. They're about the reality of the moment. Men are much more abstract, and so men will be they'll a man will be talking about, instead of the women are talking about men, when they talk about women, they'll be looking at the and they'll say, man, Rita, she had the fucking best tits I ever sucked on. Yeah, man, the Rita, she was hot, man. I'd fuck her if she wasn't with you. That's the way men talk and relate. And it gets to total immersion because when you want to explore a character, you don't necessarily want to know what they're talking about or what's on their mind, but also how it's on their mind. Because again, it's not just about the color of the eye, but what's behind the eye. And it's not just about what a person is thinking, but why they're thinking, how they're thinking, how they are conversing, how they are communicating.
So, well, what's interesting? So, I wanted to ask you this because obviously you have. I'm assuming because you've lived all over the country in different places, your understanding of people is probably much more different than mine. I was going to say in bad art, so like one of the worst movies ever made. It's amazing how now people are finally realizing it's a bad movie. You remember that film Crash?
Yes.
The one of the worst. I think it's the worst film relative to budget ever made.
Well, I mean, Brokeback Mountain and Crash, that they were the two leading contenders. They're both horrible films.
I wanted to ask about stereotyping people. Do you notice that there's any like trend? Like, like? I'm curious, as a person who's observed people like yourself, what do you think really makes a stereotype, like compared to like a real person in real life?
So what makes a stereotype?
Like, are there any like reoccurrences that you see in bad art of what's versus like compared to like a real person?
I mean, if I have a character and it's following a trope, if like that woman I said who was plotting out her novel, I can know that, oh, in chapter 13, here the character has just come to a realization, and now comes something from their past. Oh God, come on! This tells me that the writer has no clue about the organic way that art should work, because they don't observe. If you want to be an artist, you first have to understand a little bit of what life is about. How the hell can how the hell could Melville have written about Ishmael and the whole crew of the Pequod and Pip, the cabin boy for Ahab, and Ahab, and gotten this whole panoply of characters if he did not understand that these are individuals, even though they're fictive and maybe they were based upon real people who he knew. He understood these characters, but most artists don't. Most artists are doing the Whitman thing. They're trying to have that barbaric yawp into the cosmos, that I'm here. And this is one of the things that's so depressing about most artists. Not only do not the artists not have fun, but the only reason they're making the artists think, I'm here, I'm
Ego,
here. What?
vanity. I was
Yeah.
gonna say ego and
And
vanity.
this is, you just used the word ego, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that annoys the hell out of me, and even annoys Jessica more, is when 20 years ago when I was interviewed for the City Pages article in Minnesota, the guy asked me, if I was the best poet, and I said, yeah, I'm better than Whitman. I'm the best poet that I've ever read, and what? Well, how is that arrogant? I mean, I'm just simply stating something that I can back up and prove. What's really arrogant is people who would say, well, he's an arrogant motherfucker or whatnot, saying that stuff. He's not as good as this poet or that poet or whatnot. Did you read my stuff? Do you understand what makes good poetry? Or are you just there waving your fucking dick? I'm not waving my dick. I don't care. I don't care what an idiot thinks. My wife Jessica will look at these people who 15, 20 years ago wrote something about me on some fucking web board or whatnot. What do I care? These people are, they're mostly anonymous. They don't understand art. They don't even make a coherent argument as to why something is good or bad. Why would I care? Why, it's like, why would an elephant care about an ant?
I feel like when people make art, when people make art, it should become like part of them, like they need to live, but not for vanity. I don't know if that makes any sense. Like I know for a fact that when I'm not writing, I get really depressed, but it's almost like whenever I write stuff, I need to make sure it's like in my brain, it's objectively good art. I don't know if what I said makes sense because
Yes.
basically, what?
Well, why are you going to do it? Why, unless it's just intellectual masturbation, and that's fine if that's it, but don't put it out there. This is what say to so many. I've said to so many people over the years. I said, if art is just about stroking your ego or making you feel good, that's fine. But don't make me suffer for it. Because literally, truly, one of the worst things you can do is waste my fucking time with bad art. I have gotten so, I mean, I get 2,000 plus, maybe 2,500 emails a week, and aside from, and I'm not just talking about Nigerian scams and penis enlargement shit. I'm talking about people sending me bad shit, or I have a block list on my emails of probably about 800 to 1,000 writers of their emails, because I've said you don't have it. I'm going to say, because the 168th time that I send Dan a bit of doggerel, he's going to appreciate it. No. I mean, what do I have to do? The only thing I can do is block them. That doesn't make me a bad person, but don't waste my time. I read the first 7 or 8 pieces of doggerel you sent me. Why must you send me another 160? What did I ever do to you? Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, because I wanted to. That's a really important thing is the approach of an artist because I obviously, like I said, ego and vanity are just awful. Pretentiousness kills art. So for you personally, you obviously you said you have to have fun, which is important because that's kind of a myth that's popular. You have to be depressed or whatever. No, I mean, so I was going to ask, like, when you approach art, do you tell yourself, okay, so do you say, I'm Dan Schneider, I'm going to have fun making this, but it has to be great? Like, what do you tell yourself?
I say I'm going to write. I mean, there's no great imperative. I come home. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I was pissed off because there was this kid on the night crew who did something stupid and came down my aisle and started yelling at me. He's 19 years old, and a part of me is like, why am I doing that? So I told him, stop. He started raising his voice to me, and so what he had done, he had screwed up something in my department, and then tried to blame me for unscrewing it up. When the manager came in 5 or 6 hours later or whatever it was, he gave one of these things where, oh well, everyone was a little at fault. Well, no one was. We both weren't at fault. I had my work undone and screwed up by this kid who wouldn't take responsibility. So that pissed me off. So I come home and I write, and I was adding some things to my Sargon play, and in a moment there might be something that resonates from that incident that happened that'll make it into that play, and that wouldn't have made it otherwise. But I don't sit down and say, well, now I'm going to, for my next great achievement is write a great play about Sargon of Akkad and try to show how someone who lived 4,300 years ago was just as human as you or me, Michael. I don't. I write, and again, part of the fun, part of the wonderment, if you will, of art is how these things evince themselves. How does Sargon realize in my mind that if you read that play, and let's say you read that play 4,300 years from now, and when I wrote it is the midpoint from when my play was read by someone and from when Sargon existed, how much of that did I really get? Let's assume that I doubt time travel in the past is possible. But let's say you could travel back in time and be like an invisible ghost and watch the real Sargon. How much of Sargon did I capture? But does it really matter? Because I'm not really trying to capture the real Sargon of Akkad. I'm trying to make an interesting story that appeals and has characters that appeal to someone in some way intellectually, sometimes emotionally, that gives an insight into existence. Why are we here? Why do we do? There's a great television show that if you've seen on Cosmoetica that I've mentioned many times called The Prisoner. And in one of the episodes of The Prisoner, which was a 17-episode show in 1967 in the UK, there's an episode called The General. And in The General, the prisoner, who is a prisoner in this village, he's an ex-spy who's been kidnapped. The General is one of these 1960s room-sized computers, which has about the computing power of, you know, your cell phone probably has 150,000 times the computing power of this thing. But in the end of this episode, uh, the main character defeats the bad guys and the computer and types in a question. And what is that question? The question is why. And that's the ultimate question. Why anything? Why this? Why that? And art is going to get to the why of things. You can know the how, you can know the when, you can know the where, you can know the who. But the why is the thing that you can never really know. Why are people religious? Why did Sargon of Akkad do this or do that? Why does Moby Dick influence people? Why did Ahab? You know, all of these things are things that can be evinced by art, and that's the important thing. Not how, for example, fidel to reality I am about Sargon's life. I get a few facts about Sargon of Akkad. I don't need to know if he had a rose-shaped tattoo on his ass. That's ridiculous. But this is the kind of navel gazing that most art is about. I just yesterday, as we're taping, or 2 days ago, Colson Whitehead won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Colson Whitehead is a guy, and I think I when I was interviewed last year, I thought it was another black author. I forget who I mentioned, but he's a guy who wrote a fucking book called The Underground Railroad, in which he imagined, in his great leap of imagination, that instead of the Underground Railroad that took slaves from the South up to the North and into Canada to freedom back in the 19th century, what if the Underground Railroad really was a subway train that ran underground? This is the kind, and you just had the reaction that the other guy just had left. This is what modern America and modern American art and literature thinks is fucking deep. And this is what is so wrong. And this is the fucking guy who has won 2 Pulitzers. And it's not that I give a shit. Well, I'd love to make a living that I don't have to deal with snotty little kids at work like I just mentioned. But I'm not going to dumb down my shit so that it appeals to the same people who would find fucking this kind of direct good, because no one is going to read this fucking shit in 50 or 100 years, and you could give it 10,000 Pulitzers because it's Drek.
So you believe that it's obviously I haven't read it, but I'm assuming what you're talking about is like a gimmick, like the whole thing is just based around like
it's a gimmick,
having any merit.
Yeah, it's gimmick art, and gimmick art is one-dimensional. Great art is not one-dimensional because you can go back to it. You can go back to Mira, and the 17th time, 2 days before you drop dead, the 17th time that you see Mira, you'll see a little scene someplace, or you'll see maybe a tear running down one of the characters' eyes. You say, I never noticed that before.
Well, it's interesting to me how even smart people will like immerse themselves in bad art and they get something from it. Like long time ago, I knew somebody who's really smart and he was reading that awful book, Infinite Jest, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so
I know Infinite Jest.
What?
I know Infinite Jest.
Okay, so this guy, and I'm not talking about the author, but the guy who's reading the book, he kept talking about all these like really smart concepts, and I told him, you're too smart for this book. You know what I mean? It's really amazing to me because I think that even if there's bad art, I mean, wouldn't you agree that if you're smart, you'll just naturally pick up something because you're a smart person?
Yes, but your friend is probably imbuing into the book because he's been told that it's a great book by one of his friends. So he has to read it, and he has to justify the investment of time that he made into this piece of shit. I read that book in like 7 or 8 hours. I went through it like water. Again, it's asswipe. It's absolutely, and David Foster Wallace is another one of the long line of frauds. You know, whatever I want to say about Maya Angelou as a bad writer, and she was a bad writer, arguably as bad, maybe worse than Foster Wallace. I'd say Foster Wallace is worse because he's pretentious, but I'll grant Maya Angelou was at least sincere in her stupidity and ignorance. David
Like,
Foster Wallace wasn't. What?
I was gonna say like maybe like she made people feel good, I
and
guess.
and and I I'm sure Maya Angelou probably was a decent human being. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe she was a bitch to her children, or if she had children or what. I don't know. But I'm absolutely convinced that the reason someone like David Foster Wallace took his life was not because he was just simply depressed, but he knew deep down he was a fraud, and he knew deep down that no one was gonna give a shit about him, and when you know that about yourself and you know that you wasted your life, you know, if you're not someone who has the wherewithal within yourself, that's going to affect you, I would think.
Well, I mean, who knows? Maybe it was a mixture of things. Maybe he knew he was a hack and he was depressed. But
And maybe he was just an egotist. Who knows? And I don't care. You want to know why? Because I could probably talk to uh, and I have talked to random strangers. Sometimes when Jessica and I have gone out to a restaurant here in Texas before this COVID shit happened, I'll see some weird old person or whatnot, and I'll start up a conversation. Jessica will go to the bathroom, she'll come back, and I'm talking with some old guy, and I find out a little bit interesting. Maybe that character ends up in a book of mine, but that character is probably more interesting than David Foster Wallace, because I don't give a shit. I've seen David Foster Wallace being interviewed. He wasn't that fucking bright. I'm not saying he was stupid or anything. He had knowledge, but he was utterly, totally devoid of wisdom. There was nothing. There was
oh,
no part
that's
the
right.
curtain, and there's nothing.
Not the same as wisdom. That's one of the things that I'm glad you pointed out, because I met people that know a lot, but they can't. It's like they have no individuality or thought process. I'm really glad you pointed that out.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have knowledge is just facts. Wisdom is how do I use those facts? How do I use those bits of knowledge? It is the more complex thing. You can have, again, you can have all the tools. I mean, let me take it away from art and let's go into something very simple like sport. One of the reasons that sports connects with a lot of people is you can see, boom, I take a bat and hit a ball over a fence 400 feet away. Well, we know that that's a home run. It's easy to see. If I'm in the starting blocks and I'm running the 100-yard or 100-meter dash, I run it in 14 seconds. That's pretty good for a 55-year-old man. But I'm 5 seconds behind the elite athletes. Well, that tells me that Dan is not as good a runner as Usain Bolt. But if you're looking at a bad writer like David Foster Wallace, who wrote, a 600,000 word or 550,000 word book like Infinite Jest, and then you read, say, my second book, The Vincetti Brothers, which is about 600,000 words, it's going to be harder because you're going to have to think. You're going to have to think. It's easy to discern that the ball went over the fence. If LeBron James shoots a 30-foot jump shot and hits it, we hear it, swish, we see the ball go through. It's easy to discern that is success. It's much harder to discern why a film about a donkey who goes through a miserable life at the hands of human in a film by Robert Bresson 50 plus years ago is a great film, because you have to think. And one of the things that I can say is I had a friend who once said, thinking is hard.
Wow.
And it's true. People don't want to think. People want everything handed to them. People come home and they say, oh, I've had such a hard day. And I can tell you they don't have as hard a day as me. I lift every week about 14 to 15 tons of product. I mean, I not that I'm Arnold Schwarzenegger, but I've got a pretty good bicep and I'm pretty well built for a 55-year-old man. But none of that matters. Again, no one's going to give a shit. Anything that I've done in my life, in a job or not in a job, has had maybe a couple of weeks input to anyone outside of myself, or maybe my wife or a few people who are close to me. But the thing that will matter long, long, long after I'm gone will be the art. Why are you here talking to me? It's because something I wrote 15 years ago, 12 years ago, 8 years ago, or whatnot, has connected with you. And you said something went in your brain and said, oh, I get something like that. I need to know more. I'm thinking and hoping that you are looking to ameliorate yourself. I'm not doing this necessarily for me. I mean, yes, it would be nice. I think you said you're film. It'd be nice if you had a filmmaker pal and who wanted to do documentary about me. That's the best thing that could happen to me to get me out of the online box. But I'm doing it hopefully so that you will have a better mind and a better life because of the things that I've said. And I don't know you. You know, for all I know, you could be a serial killer, or you could be a tax evader, you could be a pedophile. I'm going to think that you're just a nice young guy who's looking to improve his mind. And if I can help that, I will. And that's why I'm talking to you.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's very important for younger artists to speak with older artists and exchange wisdom, and I really appreciate it. Well, it's interesting because I've always thought that great art was a club. Because obviously there's objectivity. Like there is just bad art. Like I was a kid when I was really little. I remember I'd be in like those museums where they had like little pieces that would sell for like $1 billion.
Mm.
And I would go up to my mom and dad and say like, "Wait, why is this piece like you know what I mean? Like there's just some naturally bad art that makes there's no reason for it to be like selling at an auction house. You'd be like, I'm in kindergarten, I can draw lines like that. You know what I mean? So I always thought that great art was a club, and that's when subjectivity comes in.
Let me give you an anecdote. Just save your thought. Remember what you were going to ask me here. Let me just give you an anecdote about that. On my Cosmoetica E-list about 10 years ago, I had a couple of guys from England. And one of the guys they were both buddies, and one of the guys was a bit better of a poet. The other was a lesser poet. The better poet was a bit more fucked up. The lesser poet wrote some really bad stuff. So, and I'm not going to say who it is, but you could look on my Cosmoetica. What is it? Where I keep my good poems. I don't even remember the name anymore. I've done so much shit. I can't remember all the shit I've done. But anyway, he sent me this poem, and this was maybe the 10th, 12th, 15th poem that he sent. And he kept asking me, Dan, what should I do with this one? And I'd say, well, if you remove this line and move that here. And after about 20 emails, and the last 10 of them within an hour of whatnot, I basically had rewritten about 3/4 of his poem. And it's not a great poem, but it's a good, solid, passable poem. Verse magnifique, that's where I put the poems that people submit. And it's been, I think, it's been a year since I had one poem, and I've only added maybe 2 poems in the last 5 years because I get so much shit. But this guy sends this poem, and I said, it's a good poem. And he was so ecstatic that he got on verse magnifique. He sent me, I don't know how many goddamn pieces of doggerel. And then he acted like he suddenly was a great poet. And he started sending me more shit. I said, why are you sending me this shit? And he said, yeah, but I'm a great poet now, or what? I'm like, no, you're not, you idiot. It doesn't work that way. Just because even if you had written the poem that I put online, which is a good, solid poem, even if that had been all you, that doesn't make you. Every so often, bad artists or mediocre artists will do something good. Or sometimes there's a collaborative effort that makes something good. This does not mean that you get a free pass or whatnot. This is the mindset that a lot of bad artists have. And it's just so puzzling and so, well, I wouldn't say it's puzzling, I understand it. But it's just so self-defeating, and it's like, come on, man. I mean, you can't be this stupid. Yes, they can be that stupid. Go ahead, ask me what you were going to say.
Well, what I meant by that was like, okay, so I love Woody Allen, right? I think you have an article where you're rating. It's like from 1970. It's like from his very first movie from like the 60s to like I think it's up till 1993.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And you have like scores.
Yeah.
So I objectively and subjectively agree with you. I think his best movie is Stardust Memories, which I like more than 8.5. I love 8.5, but it's a little too bloated. Like I think some editing could make them equal, but anyway, you put because I think you on your greatness scale, it's like near great is in the 90s, and then 95 plus is great. I think that's your greatness scale, correct?
Yeah.
So you put Purple Rose of Cairo, you put that as an 87. But obviously, like, and again, I always let me figure out how to say this. So you put Pope Rose of Cairo as 87, but when I was watching it, I was really thinking. Like, I mean, it made me think about all these types of weird existentialist stuff. Like, would I want life to be perfect? You know, could you adapt to a life that's not perfect? Stuff like, or could you, all these types of really abstract concepts. I got a lot of stuff intellectually, and I didn't even think I was going to get that much intellectual merit from that movie. So because it's Woody Allen, because it's a great film, I'm assuming that's when subjectivity is appropriate, correct?
Well, yeah, and you were how old when you saw that movie?
I was 21.
Okay. Now, when I saw that movie, I had grown up watching the films, silent films, and Buster Keaton, for example, has a film. Oh, I forget the name of it, but Buster Keaton also breaks into a movie, and he did this 60, 55, 60 years before the Allen, and it's not necessarily a better film than Purple Rose of Cairo, and I think Purple Rose of Cairo has the acting is not the strongest stuff in his canon, but I I'm going to come at it with a different perspective because I've seen different things and I have more knowledge about it. There are times when if I look back at something, the more that I know about it, and even with my own work, I'll give you an example. I told you I wrote 64 plays. The first two plays that I wrote were 51,000 and 59,000 words, and they were these two long plays. One was based on two women and it was a almost totally fictive play, and then the second one was based on my family, and they were very much in the vein of O'Neill and Williams and Arthur Miller, but they were I would argue that they were better than any of those plays, but when I look now at the last 15 or 20 plays that I've written, I'm so far beyond that when I look back, I'm like, well, they're still better than some of the great but flawed plays of the modern masses. But my plays now are so much richer. I'm doing so much more because I've written 50 plays or more in the interim. And the very act of going through the intellectual process of tunneling out and doing this and moving things has made me now, 3 years after I wrote that first play, much more informed about plays and playwriting and whatnot. And when I look back, even at my own early plays, they don't hold up. I can say that something is great. Let me put it another way. I can read some of the plays of Euripides or Aeschylus or who's the other one? Euripides, Aeschylus, and the third famous Greek tragedian, and I can appreciate some of the things they did. But none of those are great plays in a modern sense. I can read Shakespeare's greatest plays, and frankly, the greatest plays of Shakespeare don't measure up to the greatest plays of Shaw and Ibsen and O'Neill and Williams and Miller. They're better plays than modern masters. And in the same way, I can look at even my early plays and now my later plays, and I can see my early plays are several notches above the modern masters, and my later plays are several notches above that. And knock on wood, hopefully in 100 or 200 years, or lesser time, hopefully, there will be playwrights who will have read my stuff and moved beyond me. That's the way that it should be. And when you argue or try to say that The Tempest, which is a great play, one of the greatest of Shakespeare's play, but if you try to argue that The Tempest is as great a play as the best play of O'Neill, say, The Iceman Cometh, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. I mean, you really don't, because Shakespeare didn't have a grasp on the depth of humanity that the best of O'Neill did, and O'Neill doesn't have the grasp on the totality there, because my cosmos is necessarily larger than O'Neill's, which was necessarily larger than Shakespeare's, which was necessarily larger than the Greek tragedians, just like the world that I now at 55 is larger than when I was 35, larger than when I was 20, larger than when I was 10, 5, and just 5 months old. That's the way things happen. And you have these people like Harold Bloom that just want to suck on the nipple of Shakespeare till they bite it off. Either that no one will ever be greater than Shakespeare. Some guy once told me, "You'll never be greater than W.B. Yeats." You're an idiot. And there will be someone greater than me. And that if there isn't, then we're really in trouble as a society.
So you're saying that our art needs to just naturally get better. It's not like there's just this amazing person and then someone's equally amazing. You believe generationally it has to constantly get better and better, like
Well, I
over
mean,
time.
it should. It doesn't have to. The world isn't going to end if we've gone through dark ages before in terms of science and art. But generally speaking, yeah, because you know, why would I want to write I can't write Moby Dick because I didn't live in the 19th century. I didn't live the actual on a whaling vessel like Melville did. I can't write about being the son of an Irish drunken actor the way that O'Neill could, because he had a father who was a famed Irish drunken actor. Now, I can imagine that, and I could, and in some ways, if O'Neill himself was not a great writer, I could do that. I mean, I've written poems from the perspective of a black person that are better than any poem that Maya Angelou ever wrote from the perspective of a black person. And that's not because that I'm a white person trying to use art. It's I'm a better writer. If we want to write poems about dinosaurs, I'm going to write a better poem about dinosaurs than Maya Angelou. If I wanted to write a book about whatever subject, the same as David Foster Wallace, I'm going to have the better book because I'm a better writer. Period. And it's not that's just the way it is. Just the same way that Alexander Ovechkin, the great hockey player, can shoot a puck from 70 feet away and get it into the net past a goalie in pads, and I never could. I mean, that's just the way it is.
Gotcha. Because I think that well, I'll put it to you this way. I mean, for you at least, because you told me when you get home, you just write. You were telling me you just have fun and then you just write.
Yeah.
So for any what?
Yeah, I mean, you just right. I need to. This idea of a writer's block, and I'm not saying that some people don't have it because they might not have the wherewithal, but just stop with this thing. I want to write. There's this young kid on my list who my wife and I just shake our heads. He says, my goal in life is that in 5 years I'll be able to write a great short story. He's, I mean, he's already torpedoed himself. I mean, just making such an absurd statement is ridiculous. I mean, put the pen to paper. Look about you. See what's out there in the world. Ask questions of things. And you don't. And this idea, another cliche. Great artists don't just ask questions. Fucking Herman Melville did not write Moby Dick to ask a question. He had the answers. It's up to you to get it. And a great artist has put it out there. If when you finish reading Tumbleweeds, and let's say if you go and then you read Vincetti Brothers, and then read A Norwegian in the Family, you will go from great to greater to greatest. And the level of how much greater it gets is going to be something that should stick with you, assuming that you really have an appreciation for the art. But you know, that's just it's difficult to put it for people to understand, because people have so many preconceptions. Art should be this way. Art should be that way. No, experience the art, learn from it, get something from it if you can, and if you can't, then it didn't work. Don't worry about it. Go crochet. Go watch Mad Men reruns or whatnot if that's what makes you happy. You don't have to be an artist. Life isn't dependent. One of the great mysteries about art, or one of the great things about art that people don't get, is that art is not necessary, in the sense that you can live a perfectly fine life without ever engaging art in any meaningful way. You can live, you can eat, you can shit, you can fart, you can fuck. But if you have that ability to get the art more, art becomes more essential, because why are we here? Are we just here to fart and fuck? You know?
Yeah. But so it really, yeah, I mean, it's hard because for a lot of us, we do have preconceived notions. Like you just kind of grow up with it. You grow up around people who have preconceived notions. It's really, and you know, it's easy to bog down art because I think for some of us, it makes it easier, but that's not, obviously you shouldn't bog down anything. Cause I like, okay, so you said something interesting. You said Melville gives you answers, but we have to ask questions. Is that correct?
Well, Mel, the answers are there in Moby Dick, and great art is going to be multivalent. It's or polyvalent if you prefer. It it's not going to operate. You know, this idea that, oh, I'm going to write a mystery. Or, okay, genres are are going to be on one level, and maybe two if you have someone who's particularly good at it. If you're reading Dashiell Hammett, a classic mystery writer, Hammett was a very good writer. He wasn't a deep writer, but he was a good mystery writer. But Dashiell Hammett at his best was not Steinbeck, who you mentioned, and they were lived around the same time. They were, I guess, almost contemporaries. But the thing that separates Dashiell Hammett, a genre artist, from John Steinbeck, who is just an artist, is that Steinbeck was polyvalent or multivalent. He worked on many levels, or at least a handful of levels. It's not just about, oh, I need to know the meaning of life. I mean, personally, there's not a particular meaning of life. You make life meaning from your own life. This is one of the grand things about being a human being. And when we were talking earlier, and I mentioned about what makes humans different than animals, is I can decide whether or not my life has meaning. You can decide whether yours does and mine has meaning in your life. You can reject it, or you can accept it, or you can just be not even engage it. That's the thing that you have. That's the power you have. And that's a greater superpower that you have, because it will ultimately affect the universe that you carry around in yourself. And that's more powerful than this juvenile obsession with Superman or these Marvel action heroes or whatnot. I was asked to write for this site Quora about 5 or 6 months ago, and I got really depressed looking at all of these people who write these extensive, I mean, sometimes 10,000 word posts about, oh, well, Superman, he's a better superhero. Superman is stronger than fucking Thor. Who gives a shit? Who gives a shit? These are childish memes. You know, anyway, I apologize because I sometimes go off because I deal with so much idiocy in life, and it's good to talk about intelligent things. So hopefully you're getting something.
No, like I understand completely. Like, I mean, obviously, you know, I'm in my 20s and I'm growing. My generation's growing up on all the Marvel movies. I think Avengers Endgame, which came out last year, is like the highest grossing film of all time.
Mm.
And I think that for a lot of people, what bothers me is the fact that it's like that's all they expose themselves to.
Yeah.
So it's not even that they enjoy it, it's just like the lack of like actually, like, I'll give you an example. When I'm at school, I literally had professors come up to me. This is kind of like a Bill Hicks joke. I think he made a similar joke about this. I've had professors come up to me, get excited that I'm reading. And they're like, "Is that for school? Is that for lit class?"
Yeah.
And I'm like, "No, I'm just reading a book."
Mm.
Like,
Well,
this has happened to me several times. Like, I was reading Sweet Thursday, the Kerry Rose sequel by Steinbeck,
yeah.
and this isn't even like a famous book you read for class. This is just something for my own benefit.
Yeah.
And one of the teachers gives me this look like, "Oh my god."
Yeah.
Like you know, like I'm a creature in a
Well,
city.
you know what happens. I mentioned earlier this kid who had started an argument with me yesterday, and today he was using a power jack to pull out a pallet of water through the doors from the back room to the store's floor, and he's on his fucking cell phone. And when he's on his cell phone texting with one hand and the other hand on the jack, he pulls the jack and he knocks some glass bottles of water off, and they fall and the water spills all over the floor. Now, this is what people do. They're so obsessed with this minutia. They got to text. They got to get the latest meme. What is it that the FOMO, fear of missing out, they call it. Missing out on, my friend Jeannie farted at the party last night, and people thought it was so funny. Ha ha! What a great meme. Well, I mean, no wonder you're a fucking professor. I mean, Jessica and I were at a restaurant 3 or 4 years ago, and I remember seeing the man and the woman. They're both on their cell phones while they're waiting for this the stuff to eat. I said to Jessica, I bet you they're texting each other across the table. And I'd say there's probably a better than 50% chance that's exactly what they were doing. They were probably texting each other. It's insane. This, I said this in this other interview I did last year with this British guy, is like, this should be a golden age of reading. My God, you just have to download a Kindle app, go to Project Gutenberg. You can read Jack London, all of his books for free. You can read Tristram Shandy. You can read Don Quixote. You can read The Tale of Genji, a 1,000-year-old novel written by a woman. There's so much out there that is free to read. And what do people do with this great technology? Oh, here, let me open up my zipper and send a dick pic to my girlfriend. Oh no, my professor got my penis. Yeah. Oh, hey, Susie, let me lick your clit on camera. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, not suitable for work. Why are you sending around a picture of your girlfriend's clitoris?
Yeah, that's what bothers me. It's not even so much that people have fun doing other shit. It's just it's the lack of like engagement in other things. That's what really bothers me. Like, okay, so I got a subscription not that long ago to the Criterion Channel streaming service.
That's a
So
good service. That's a good service. You should get that.
I'm watching a bunch of the Antonioni movies right now. I'm really trying to get better. And it really bothered me because I have Netflix, and I enjoy watching some stuff on Netflix. I have Amazon Prime, but like, it bothers me that you have to get a separate streaming service for those older iconic movies. Like, that really bothered me. Like, why aren't more of these films on Netflix? Like, the only like older iconic film that I've seen on Netflix was like The Stranger, the Wells movie, and that's not even his best movie.
Yeah, and that's in public domain. That's why it's there.
So that really, and again, like, I don't mean that as an elitist, because I like comic books. Like, I still enjoy the Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies. It's the lack of involvement in the other stuff that really bothers me. You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, and I remember seeing the Spider-Man movies, and Tobey Maguire, they were good movies. And actually, the second one, I think, which is totally slagged on, was a better movie than is given credit for. And then you look at other stuff, and there was that Dark Knight movie with Heath Ledger. I mean, that was a terrible performance. Yeah, I mean, it was so poorly written, so poorly acted, and yet he won a fucking not a Pulitzer, an Oscar for badly playing a ridiculously bad comic book character. Is there any more boring character in pop culture than Bruce Wayne or Batman? I mean, it's so over. Okay, you could argue James Bond has shot his load or whatnot. But Jesus Christ, I mean, there's so much interesting things that could be done. And this is what happens when you have corporations getting into it and trying to milk stuff.
Like Disney, because they own Marvel. They before they hire the directors, they literally have like the storyboards of what they want. So it's like, why even hire the directors? I read an LA Times article. I don't know if you're familiar with the director Edgar Wright. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Edgar
Wright.
He
did what?
Edgar Rice.
Edgar Wright. I don't know if you're familiar with that director.
No. What did he do?
Shaun of the Dead.
Okay. I haven't seen all of Shaun of the Dead, but I've seen enough of it. I mean, it's a cute little jaunt on the zombie thing, yeah.
But anyway, he was working on one of the Marvel movies, and he basically was like, I think it was kind of a combination of getting fired and quitting. And there was an LA Times article where he's like, yeah, directors, they don't feel like they have a say anymore. It's and for these, like, at least these big budget movies. And it was really heartbreaking reading that, because it is corporate.
Well, this is the thing that I've interviewed numbers of actors. I haven't a few actors who had some TV shows in the 80s or 90s are the biggest names I've gotten. But I mean, if I were an actor and I'm what's her name, Scarlett Johansson, or I'm Halle Berry, or I'm Tom Cruise, or I'm Brad Pitt, or the big name, reliable $20 million a movie stars. Why wouldn't I want to challenge myself? Why wouldn't I want to say, okay, I'm going to do this shitty Marvel movie and get my 20 million off the top, and then alternate, and then do 2 or 3 little films. I'll tell you, someone I really respect is, I think Heath Ledger was not a particularly good actor. He was terrible in Brokeback Mountain. He was terrible in The Dark Knight. He was terrible in that A Knight's Tale, I think it was. Um, but his girlfriend or wife or whatever she was, Michelle Williams, she's a good little actress. I shouldn't say little, she's 40 years old, but she's a good actress. And she's a far better actress than he ever was. And she's done movies. I saw her in a couple of movies by this female director a few months ago that my wife got me into. The name of the female director, I can't remember. One of the movies was set in Oregon. She's from Oregon and does a number of films in Oregon. And I was like, damn, that Michelle Williams, she's really a good actress. She's not the best actress I've ever seen or whatnot, but she doesn't get nearly the credit that Heath Ledger did, and her corpus and is so much better. Now, I don't think that's sexism. I think that's just plain old stupidity, you know. But it just shows you most of pop culture, most criticism is worthless. And when you said we can talk about life and other stuff too. It's the same thing with these election cycles. These people who just want to keep voting Democrat and Republican because God forbid I should vote for a Green Party candidate. I actually have a handful of interviews that I sent out yesterday for minor party candidates because I'm sick and tired of hearing the same bullshit from the Republicans and Democrats, and I'm sick and tired of reading the same critical bullshit. I'm sick and tired. As much as I love Godzilla and I love the original King Kong versus Godzilla, but I'm not going to watch this shit remake of King Kong versus Godzilla that's coming out. I mean, that's not Godzilla was never a realistic character. It wasn't meant to be realistic, even in the first film or whatnot. And now they want to do, I guess they call it the kaiju verse because we have the Marvel characters, and now you see online who would win
versus for like this franchise.
Who would win in a fight, the Hulk or Godzilla? Could Thor's hammer kill Godzilla? What the fuck? I mean, why don't you just zip down your pants, pull out your penis, and just jerk in public? Because there's no reason for these movies. There's absolutely no reason for this. Why don't we have the promotion of filmmakers like a young Antonioni? I'm sure that there are people who would want to move the art form of cinema forward. But again, it's money. Why do we get David Foster Wallace being published by stuff, and yet in the hundreds, if not a couple of thousand of things that my wife Jessica sent around for me and her, why isn't Jessica or Dan Schneider published? Why am I having to work backbreaking work with disrespectful little punks that don't know anything about anything? Why do I have to have people constantly sending me garbage that I have to sweat? And I feel a certain amount of, I mean, there's always in mind, I wouldn't say it's a fear, but there's always a part of me that's like, I should open this email and read this person's stuff. It's probably adorable, but there's a 1 in 20,000 chance that it's a good solid poem or I can give a word of encouragement. I do it. My wife Jessica says, stop caring about things. Stop caring about these shit jobs that I work. Stop caring about other people. Care only for yourself. But that's just not how I'm wired. And I want to see people. There was a girl who was on my e-list many years ago who sent me a poem just a few days ago, and I said, this is probably the best thing you've written. Now she's totally screwed up her own personal life. I won't get into the details. But she wrote an excellent poem, and I had to explain to her why it was good. This is what I talked about dart tossing. I said, then she sent a second one. I said, if you remove those first 3 stanzas and start the poem here, the first 3 stanzas were filled with cliches, but the third stanza starts on a very precarious note. I said, that's where the poem starts. I once had a guy who came to my Uptown Poetry Group in Minneapolis. He wrote a 5.5-page poem. I looked through the poem, and on the last page were the final 14 lines. I said, this is your sonnet. This is your poem. I said, why the fuck did you wait? Most people, and there's a fellow who's a poet, Bruce Ario, who I've posted on my Verse Magnifique. He's someone who is the archetype of the artist who is totally clueless. Because he has written probably 15 to maybe 20, 25 great little Ario 10-line poems. And then a lot of the other stuff is solid, okay, but he's written far more shit than he's ever written great stuff. But he doesn't have a clue what the difference between great and bad is. And most people don't. even people who are intelligent, and that I have to explain to this young woman why her poem is good is just it's just in some ways mind blowing. I mean, I've accepted that by now, but if it, it's just an odd thing.
Well, it's really interesting to me when you talk about how, because what's fascinating is just how many people are intellectual frauds either in academia. There's a lot of people in academia who I find to be frauds, and then there's a lot of people that aren't even in academia who are frauds. Fraud, I don't know if that's a noun, like is a subject matter, but fraud. Yeah, that is. So, all that stuff hacked. I mean, it's ubiquitous. It's applicable to so many different things. So, one thing that I wanted to ask you about, this was really driving me, I don't want to say crazy, but I was really thinking about it. So, I'm studying a bunch of Antonioni movies right now. I watched La Notte, and then I was watching Red Desert.
Mm-hmm.
I love La Notte more. And then I put on because he's huge in my generation, is Paul Thomas Anderson. I put on There Will Be Blood, and I remember in your review, you were like, I can only imagine what a true visionary like an Antonioni would do. And I kind of want to know, because Antonioni gets accused of being plotless. People say his movies are boring. So what is a quote unquote? I'm saying boring in a non-pejorative sense. What is what makes a boring, quote unquote, film by Antonioni great, and not something like There Will Be Blood or Paul Thomas Anderson?
Well, because it's not really boring, and that's the guy who called Kubrick's 2001 just landscape. These people are idiots, and people use these kinds of epithets against film. Antonioni, I've always said, is I always pair him with Bergman. Bergman looks at the human condition with a microscope. He gets in, you can see almost the pores on the faces of some of his characters when he goes close up. Antonioni looks at humanity from the end of a telescope. He's out in the big picture. And if you've seen Red Desert, one of the greatest all-time sequences in film history is when the mother character, who's nuts, is telling her son, who's faked an injury or an illness, the story about the girl on the beach and the singing.
There's the humming in the background.
And it's a song called Astrale. I forget who's the singer, but and that the whole cosmos is singing, and it's such a great, powerful moment, and that's something that someone like Paul Thomas Anderson, who's a good, solid, capable filmmaker, could never conceive of. He's never going to have a moment like that in any of his movies. Just like there's never going to be a moment like the ending of O Hussar Balthazar with the dying donkey in a Spielberg movie. There is never going to be any of half a dozen of the great moments in an Orson Welles film, in the films of the guy who did the Dark Knight trilogy, Chris Nolan. You're never going to have that, because these guys, even if they have the ability to be an artist, they have sold out and they've neutered themselves. They're never going to have that, because they've cut off their testicles. They have willingly become eunuchs. They are artistic eunuchs. They have sold out, and they will not be better. Just like Pynchon sold out. Pynchon has a little bit of talent. He could have been something more. I've argued with a number of people. We're talking about Vonnegut. Think of Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, and it's basically, in many ways, the same story as Slaughterhouse-Five. Yet,
I couldn't do Gravity's Rainbow. I couldn't get to it.
Yeah, but it's 6 times as long. It's not funny in the least. Pynchon and David Foster Wallace are some of the driest, least humorous writers going. Vonnegut, at his best, was such a great writer because he could, even more so than Hemingway, could have that rat-a-tat-tat little boom, 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 and end with the, pooty wheat, of the bird. Life goes on, pooty wheat. That's just that little moment there that recurs in Slaughterhouse-Five is, again, something ideationally beyond Thomas Pynchon. You're never going to get that. If you look in and you're reading my Tumbleweeds, Pynchon could never come up with something that functions. The function, forget even the quality, but the function of the legend teller sequences in that book. If you've read one or two of them so far.
Well, the thing is, well, right now I'm finishing your. I have two things. So I'm finishing your Scenes from a City, reading
Okay.
different stories in that, and then I'm only on Tumbleweeds.
Yeah. Oh.
You know, and I can already tell. Like, I love reading Tumbleweeds. I tried so hard to read the Pynchon stuff. Like, I really try to be open minded, and just I can't really remember much from it. And what bothers me is about Pynchon is that there are occasional passages where you can see there is something there. Like, I think there is talent, but he's mired in so much crap.
Don DeLillo is an even better writer, but he's someone. If you've read his most famous book, which is Underworld, Don DeLillo has a good short story that opens that. It was published as a short story. It's about the 1951 Major League Baseball playoff game between the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers, and then the rest of the book is just a piece of shit. And so, why do we have this really good, if not great, but a good to very good short story of maybe 6,000-7,000 words that opens the book, and then why do we have another, I don't know, 250,000 words of garbage? And this tells me this is someone, and Cormac McCarthy is another one. These are people who have these fleeting moments, but at some level they fucking sold out. I'll give you an example. I don't know how much you're into poetry. I think you said you're not into poetry, but a good
I'm here and there. You know,
there,
I mean, I have a E. Cummings collection, a Rilke collection, a Plath collection, and I've read poetry on your website.
And there's a guy named Robert Bly who wrote a book called Iron John back in the late 90s. Started this idiotic thing called the men's movement. And Robert Bly was a poet who had some real talent. You can see it in some of his early stuff. And then he decided to become famous. And he wrote this ridiculously intellectually sterile book. Other poets have done the same thing. And again, it's this, you know, I mean, I'd love to be able to make a living. I don't have to be a millionaire. If I could make, or Jessica and I combined could make what we're making now and be able to have medical insurance and just go off into a small Texas town farther west from Austin area where we live, I'd do that in a heartbeat. But I'm not going to sell myself out for that. I'm not going to compromise about that, because ultimately it's not about me. Art is not about the artist. Art is always about the recipient. There's no fucking reason for an artist to exist. Just to, I know the thing. I know, even though I don't know what I'm gonna, all the words that are gonna appear in my Sargon play as we record now, I know that what I'm gonna do is gonna have great value to others. But ultimately, whatever that turns out to be about, I already know. I just don't know the specifics. That's again part of the fun part. But that art exists for you. That art exists for someone who's going to be born in 512 years, assuming we don't fuck with the planet. That's going to be there for that Andromedan in 10,000 years, flying across the cosmos that I can only vaguely grasp rather.
And that's why you call your site Cosmoetica.
Well, it's two reasons: cosmos and poetica. But cosmos meaning the cosmos, and cosmos also meaning peace. You know, that there's a sense of inner peace there too. So that's what we're the alternate would have been omniversica, which but cosmoetica.com was more alliterative, so I went with that. And I didn't want to have danschneider.com, because then I get confused with that fat bastard who makes these terrible children's TV shows.
And that's another thing I wanted to ask. What is good for kids? Because, you know, because some people
treat kids like miniature adults. When I was a kid, and I'm not saying all kids are going to be smart, or all kids are going to be smart as me, but stop talking down to them. You don't have, I mean, look at a great children's book. I wrote a great children's book called The Kid's Book, but probably one of the greatest children's book you could read is Pinocchio. Pinocchio is dark and it's complex, and Pinocchio doesn't give a fuck, and I mean the book, not the character, but the book of Pinocchio doesn't give a fuck about about political correctness because it didn't exist, and it doesn't give a fuck about any of that shit. It wants to tell a story and impart some wisdom, and it's aimed at children, but an adult can get something from it too. Carlo Collodi, and I think his real name was Carlo Lorenzini, but Carlo Collodi, his pen name, was, I mean, in that one book alone, he showed he was a true artist. And I've read some of his other stuff, and it's okay, but it's not in a league with Pinocchio. Pinocchio is his grand masterpiece or whatnot. But that, you don't talk down to children. You know, when you know, it's interesting. The people who get the most annoyed at me online and whatnot, they're usually these neck-bearded white guys who are insecure. They're these guys who would go around in a fucking truck and say, "Oh, Vern, look, there's a nigger. Let's kill him." These are these fucking inbred mutant motherfuckers that don't like me. I can tell you, in all the years that I've worked with people, one of the things I found the most curious is that the people who really like me the most tend to be minority people and black people. And the reason is that if a black person acts like an asshole, I'll say, don't be a fucking asshole. You know, don't, you know, I treat them, there's no difference there. I don't put them on a pedestal. I don't look at them as below me. And the same thing I do that with children is that, yes, I'm obviously smarter than a 7-year-old, but if I'm talking to, and I've talked to children before, both the children of people I know and my own niece when she was young, and you know, I talk with them. I don't say, "Oh, goo goo gaga, yes, you know, oh, you're such a sweet little girl." I don't fucking condescend to people. Why? I don't want to be condescended to. The worst thing you can do as an artist is condescend to people. Always write up, always create art upward for those people up there. Assume that your audience is smart, even if they're 99% of them are fucking morons, because you want to reach that 1% that's going to get something. Most people aren't going to get something. Most people, most of life passes through them and it's shat out the end. They don't, they are constitutionally incapable of getting it. I tell my wife, Jessica, who gets frustrated, I said, she'll say, "Why don't people get it? It's so easy for me or you." I said, "Yes, but we're the freaks. We're the freaks. Most people aren't going to get that." And, but there is this network of freaks that, you know, Homer, if he existed, was a freak. Lady, I forget her name, Lady Murasaki, who wrote The Tale of Genji, was a freak. What's his name? The guy who wrote Don Quixote, he was a freak. Um, and Orson Welles was a freak. Antonioni was a freak. Kurosawa was a freak. But again, it's the freak brigade that drags the rest of the knuckle draggers along, whether they like it or not. Because every generation, and I've said this many times before, so I'm repeating myself, is the same people who are going to write anonymously on something and say, "Oh, Dan Schneider sucks," this or whatnot. Who gives a shit? Because there are going to be more people like you. Once I'm safely dead, and I can't be speaking out and whatnot. I for one time I got invited to speak at a college, and then by the kids. Most people who read Cosmoetica are teenagers, and most of them are young males like yourself. I was invited to speak to a college in Iowa, and after the kids invited me, 3 or 4 of them invited me to speak. The professors put a kibosh on it, and I said, "Well, that's fine. I didn't want to go." I said, I can do a video, a Skype talk or whatnot." It was about 5 or 6 years ago. And they said, "No, they didn't think that you were a proper subject or whatnot." And I forget the name of the kids. I never heard from them again. But this is the kind of thing. Why is a young man like yourself, college age, why are you able to see that I'm saying something that has value and wisdom? You haven't been indoctrinated yet. You've even said it. If when I replay this or whatnot, or you watch this on, you've even basically said that you have rebelled against being indoctrinated. Most people don't. They want to be lemmings. They want to be zombies. They want to just vote Democrat and Republican. They just want to be accepted. They just want to have someone have their hand on their penis while they have their hand on the penis of the guy behind them and circle jerk. This is.
Oh, absolutely. Like the tribalism is just, it's freaky, man. It is freaky. Tribalism is such an awful thing. Like, you know, I always reference Space Odyssey with that, because you see all these apes and they're fighting over, you know, the little river of water, and they're just apes. There's nothing really to fight a battle, and they're in these tribes, and we don't know why they're in the tribes. You know what I mean? And I see people act the same way. Like they have no intellectual capacity. They just bond with other people over minor reasons that really you shouldn't bond over. It's crazy.
This is, I mentioned the divine inspiration fallacy. One of the things that I've noticed, and I noticed this at the Uptown Poetry Group, is people, when they believe that creativity is out there and that I'm divinely inspired, well, this creates a problem, because if I'm going to the Uptown Poetry Group, and in 20 times that I've gone, I've never written anything great, but I see that Dan has written at least 17 or 18 great poems out of 20 times, and the other 2 or 3 times it was just merely excellent. Well, Dan somehow is getting something from the cosmos, and because it's not dependent upon me, if Dan is pulling down great poems from the cosmos, there's less up there for me. And I'm going to resent Dan for that because he's taking something that I could have. Well, this is absolutely nonsense, because there is no divine inspiration. Everything that I've ever written comes from me. That doesn't mean that I'm not influenced by Walt Whitman or not influenced by Norman Mailer even. But you, if you're writing or whatnot, no matter what I succeed or fail at, has nothing to do with you. You're going to succeed or fail on your own merits, but if we have this idiotic belief that creativity is somehow detached on, and this gets to why I'm against supernaturalism and whatnot. I'm a materialist in terms, not financially, but in terms of philosophically, is if we believe in this garbage that there's absolutely no proof, zero proof. You have free will, I have free will. Recent science in the last 10 or so years has shown this really unambiguously, and I don't want to go into all of it, but if you believe in the supernatural crap that somehow if I succeed, that means you have to fail, that's stupid. Creativity isn't a zero-sum game like that. You have as many chances to write and do something or create a piece of art. That's great if you really are willing to sacrifice and have the ability, as you can do. And nothing I can say or do can deter that from you. Only you can. And you have to accept the responsibility that if you succeed or fail, it's on you. If I succeed or fail, it's on me. And people don't like that because they don't want to have responsibility. We live in an irresponsible society, socially, personally, sexually, in any way you can conceive of. Whether it's some kid who wants to piss and moan at me because oh, God forbid that I move something 5 feet out of the way that he had put there that shouldn't have been there in the first place, or whether it's because David Foster Wallace, just wanted to yank his chain or whatnot and didn't want to actually take responsibility for it. Maybe, oh, I've got this opportunity that a lot of writers would kill for, but I'm just going to fuck around and see if I can bang some stupid broad. This is one of the major problems. See, now you're getting me angry here. Yeah, I'm getting no, but this is the kind of stuff that really does frustrate and annoy me because people want everything handed to them. They don't want to work for it. And if I complain or my wife Jessica complains, we have a legitimate reason to complain. We have a legitimate gripe because my wife, next to me, is the greatest writer that I know. And if you ever get a chance to read her stuff, I can send you some of her stuff. But
absolutely, I'd love to.
But
I just read the After Dolly poem on.
Oh yeah, but she's a better prose writer than a poet, and so her. But anyway, I'm taught. Just my wife is in the kitchen, so Jessica Schneider is a great writer. So when she reads this or watches this sometime, I'll have acknowledged that. But other than that, yeah, people don't want to take responsibility. They don't. It's such ego. And this is where I'm not saying I'm without ego, but ego in and of itself is neither good nor bad. It's how you use the ego or what you're claiming for it. If I were to claim that I were a grand chess master, and I'm clearly not, that would be ridiculous. That would be arrogant. the so many bits of arrogance that I see in art are not from people who are claiming they're great when they're not, or vice versa. But it's usually people who will make these absurd statements. They can't back them up, or they're, oh, Philip K. Dick was a genius. No, he wasn't. Read, I in the science fiction book that I did, which I think I sent to you, which is the third of the heroic trilogy. What I do is one of the greatest things you'll ever see in any book is I take a public domain story by Philip K. Dick and I incorporate it.
Is this the skull one?
Yeah, the skull.
Okay, that's the one where the guy keeps getting like he's in a time loop, right?
Do you read that book already?
No, I think I heard you talk about it.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, it's the skull, yeah. So I use that story and I deconstruct the story with the character. I take the character and use it in the story, and I show what a real piece of shit the original story was. So trite. So, I mean, it was trite even when it was written, but I use it within a context that frames it. So I take the essentials of the story, expand it, and show literally side by side later on. A computer analyzes in the novel. A computer analyzes the story, and because the character is telling the story that tells the story has added his own stuff in. The computer wasn't able to match it up with the story, and this shows the flaws of the computer. But anyway, if you ever get a chance to read that sci-fi book, it's a really brilliant deconstruction, and there's nothing like it in all of literature. And Philip K. Dick, as I said, every movie or every television show that was ever adapted from his works is better because he had some interesting ideas. He had zero ability to create character or to make meaningful stories of any depth. He was an idea guy, but that's about all he had.
It's interesting to me because it almost feels, at least from what I can gather from your writing and criticism, because there's a great chunk of the population that's not very intelligent. I'm not saying all people are evil, but there's a great chunk of us who are just, assholes. But it seems like even with the asshole-ish people or the idiots, there's still like a complexity there to the way they think and view things. Like, what was the one thing that, okay, like, so you're not a fan of Hitchcock, from what I've understood.
I mean, Hitchcock is a good popcorn movie maker. There are movies of his I enjoy. There are a few of his films. If Hitchcock had not sold his soul for money, he could have been an auteur. He probably had the ability to be a great artist, but Hitchcock wanted to live comfortably. Hitchcock, in a sense, was the antithesis of Orson Welles.
The reason I brought him up was because I think I read somewhere that you felt that his characters sucked. I could be misquoting you.
His characters are cardboard cutouts. In that sense, he's a precursor to Spielberg. He's a better filmmaker than Spielberg. But I enjoy some of his movies. North by Northwest is a good light popcorn movie thriller. Some of the stuff like Rope showed there are 5 or 6 of his films that show the filmmaker he could have been had he not sold his soul, and that's the shame of it.
Because I remember in your Kurosawa review for the High and Low, was that the one?
Yes, High and Low, brilliant film.
Okay, so at the very end of the film, there's that guy because I don't think the guy ended up poor, correct? He ended up having a smaller business. Wasn't that the ending?
He ended Kingo Gondo, I think is his name. He ended up working for another company, a smaller company, and seems to be in line to take that over. And he got humbled, and yeah. But go ahead.
I was gonna say because there's that scene where he's confronting the guy who set up the whole kidnapping. Yeah. And he's like having a bit of a breakdown. He's rattling the bars there. And I think I recall you mentioning in that review that you felt that Hitchcock characters have like some grand reason for doing things. Like I forgot how you phrased it. You made a comment about how Hitchcock didn't understand motivation, how people work. And
well, yeah, Hitchcock was plot driven. Hitchcock's characters are basically all marionettes. They're there to look. In a couple of the films she does, I mean, Grace Kelly is jaw-droppingly gorgeous. You just as a heterosexual male, I would have licked her from toe to top of her head. But her character has nothing. None of his characters, with two or three exceptions maybe, none of his characters have any real depth. If you look at Wells or you look at Kurosawa, Kingo Gondo is a character that something bad happens. He is a believable, real character that something bad happens to. When something bad happens to whatever character in a Hitchcock film, it's done to get a quick fright. And Hitchcock was good at getting. He was good at the lowest common denominator stuff. I mean, he was a good pop artist, but you can't compare Hitchcock to Antonioni. You cannot compare Hitchcock to Bresson. You cannot compare Hitchcock to Tarkovsky. That's absurd. Spielberg is not Kubrick. That's absurd. Spielberg is closer to Ed Wood or the guy who did The Room. You know.
Tommy Wiseau.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think Ed Wood was actually out of the three the best. I mean, he makes me laugh the most.
Yeah, I mean, unintentionally.
You know, like they don't have that same pretension that the other ones had.
And that's one of the things that kills in art is pretension. You know, this idea that that all are you can do a small story. I would much rather see a small film or read a small short story that doesn't have pretension, but that is well executed and has a little moment of insight, even if it's not great, than some big bloated piece of shit. We don't need to have. I mean, if I'm an actor, I mean, yes, it's nice to make money, and I don't begrudge an actor wanting to have that big score or whatnot. But if I've done a few blockbusters, if I'm Matt Damon, and he rode the coattails of the Robin Williams movie that he claimed to have written, even though he and
The Hunting.
Yeah, and that he and Affleck claimed to have written, even though they didn't write it. They were 20 years old.
What? Did you think it was a good movie?
It was a good movie, good solid prose movie. It wasn't deep nor poetic, but if he really was the artist that he claimed to when he supposedly wrote that, well, why hasn't he done anything even remotely of that quality since? I mean, why? Because that he stumbled upon that by having rewrites by script doctors and whatnot that took an absurd spy plot or whatnot that it was originally supposed to be and made it into that movie. That's how you can tell the people who really are. I mean, whatever you want to say. I mean, about the Ed Woods or the Tommy Wiseaus, at least their crap, is unpretentious. But so much of the stuff that's full of pretension, the stuff by the Spielbergs, the stuff that this Hollywood crash, Brokeback Mountain stuff. If I have to spoon feed you that Nazis are not good people. Well, that's me basically saying you're an idiot. Open your mouth, let me shit in it, and then you can munch down on my shit.
I've seen so many movies that are like, hey, check it out, black people are people too.
Yeah.
You're like, no shit, I'm not a sociopath. Everyone's equal. Like, what do you know what I mean? And that's kind of one of the last things I wanted to ask you about, because we're talking about, like, if we're talking about PC films or films that are like emotional, that are great, like compare 12 Years a Slave, which was a brutal but great movie, to I think you put that on your list of great films, right? 12 Years a Slave.
Yeah, but of his first three films, it's the least of the three. The first one in the Irish prison was a great film. The greatest film was Shame of his. The film, from what some people on my E-list, I haven't seen his fourth film. They said it was by far his worst, and it was the most conventional. And I hope to hell he fucking stops that. If you look at Nuri Bilge Ceylan, the Turkish filmmaker, he's probably the premier filmmaker in the world right now. In terms of big ideas and whatnot, but anyway.
But like, what is the difference between a great film like 12 Years a Slave versus like a Schindler's List? Why does 12 Years a Slave make you think, whereas Schindler's List is just like a one-dimensional message. Like what is
You just said
the
it. It's a one-dimensional message. Yeah, you know, killing Jews and burning them in ovens, that's not good. I'm against nuclear war because there's such a great pro-nuclear Holocaust faction out there. You know what? I don't think that we should beat up people just because they like sucking cock. I don't believe that because you have dark skin and more melanin that you should be shot. You know, I don't think that you should take that puppy and bang its head against a rock until its brains bleed out. I don't think that you should be a priest and pull down the pants of choir boys and fuck them till they scream. You know, these are kinds of things that, no shit. Again, yes, if I'm making a film for a bunch of psychopaths, well, but even if I was making a film for a bunch of psychopaths, they're not going to care, nor get, or get. You can't preach to people like
Could
that.
you imagine? Could you imagine if somebody saw one of these like really PC terrible movies, like if somebody saw Crash and was like, "Huh, I guess that racism is bad." Like I just don't imagine that happening.
Well,
You know?
yeah. Well, suppose I'm a skinhead and I've got Nazi tattoos on my back, and on one arm I said kill the spics, and the other one said beat the fags. Oh, but I'm gonna go in and watch Crash, and I'm gonna come out and say, man, I got to grow my hair back and get those tattoos removed, and that black kid that I beat with a bat last year, I'm gonna go turn myself in. In what world is that going to happen?
Well, I don't know if you ever saw there's a parody called Oscar, what's it called? Seth Meyers did a parody video on YouTube. I think it's called White Savior. And it's like, it shows like the makers of Crash and, all these other films. And then it says, this movie features the super cartoonishly racist, who's so cartoonishly racist, he makes regular racists feel okay about themselves. And then at the end it says, now the cartoonishly racist is somehow magical friends with the black person saying, you're all right. I learned a lesson. That shit doesn't happen, but,
Well, I'll give you an example. Speaking of pop culture, I've watched for over 40 years a few soap operas. My favorite soap opera, the only one that's still on, is General Hospital. My wife sometimes gets on me for watching it, but I feel a loyalty to the show, even though it's much shittier than it was. But there was this trope back in the 1980s, the late 70s, 80s, and 1990s on ABC soaps where they would have bad girls, the girl who would come to town and sleep around and do this. And the way they reformed these bad girls was to have a male character on the show rape them. And this happened 4 or 5 times. Now, where this idea that I'm a stuck-up, snobby, cunt bitch that wants to steal people's boyfriends and do all kinds of bad, but if I get sexually traumatized in rape, all of a sudden I'm going to be good. And this is one of those things that sociologically, there was a character called Luke Spencer that raped a character called Laura on General Hospital. But the most famous and the most psychologically complex of this was a character played by an actor, a very good actor named Roger Howarth, called Todd Manning on One Life to Live. And if you Google Todd Manning, you can find literally dozens of theses, college theses, and papers written about the psychosexual variables of this character Todd, who raped another bad girl on his soap opera, and the fallout from that. And it's just a bizarrely fascinating thing in the year 2020 to look back 25, 30, 40 years about how a television network could have its whole suite of shows devoted to the idea that the way that you make a bad woman good is to rape her. But this is the kind of simplistic pop culture, and yet here in 2020 we have a bunch of simpletons that will vote for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or Joe Biden, whether Trump and Biden are rapists or not, I don't know. It wouldn't shock me. Uh, and yet, even that, we have people like Barack Obama, 8 years of president, probably responsible for the death of somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people by drone strikes. Certainly not Hitlerian numbers. Certainly not as bad as Genghis Khan. But he is the first black president in the U.S. and he's nothing but a mass murderer too. In the end, all. And now I'm getting into politics. We'll save that for another show. But
Yeah. We've been at it for 2 hours, 48 minutes. Should we wrap it up?
Sure. If you want to end now, or do you have a final question?
So you don't. So would you say it's a fallacy for an artist to say that they have to make a statement? Like if they make a piece of art, that there's some type of statement. Would you say that's a fallacy?
Any art is going to be a statement. I mean, the very nature, it's going to state something. This is one of the things where people, when identity art, is just so stupid. It's like, well, let's see. If I write, if you read my stuff and you're reading a book, my 2.5 million word novel on gangsters in the 1960s and the mafia, well, that should tell you that Dan has an interest in criminology. If you're reading my sci-fi book and I'm talking about, and you see tropes from Forbidden Planet or Star Trek or half a dozen other famous science fiction works or whatnot, or maybe 3 or 4 dozen of them, well, Dan has some kind of interest in that. If I write a poem about a dying coelacanth, well, Dan has an interest in that. I mean, I don't have to say that I'm white. I don't have to say that I have a penis. I don't have to say that I was born in the mid 20th century. I don't have to say this, that, because the range of interest will show that. Now, there's going to be some things that are totally beyond. The fact that I'm writing about Sargon of Akkad shows I have an interest in history, but maybe I could have written that 100 years from now or 200 years from now. But that same artist, but another artist in 200 years, who will grow up maybe on a space station revolving around Jupiter and spend his whole life having grown up on Jupiter station and has never set foot on Mother Earth. That person is going to have that reflected in their art some way, somehow. It will be there. It doesn't have to say, oh, this is, Michele Mbumba, who grew up on Jupiter station and was born in the year 2186 and, is writing in 2240 about his growing up on Jupiter station because now he's moved to, the green state of Mars because Mars has now been colonized and what. All of these things are going to be incumbent and an essential part of that person. This is why, if I were gay, for example, why do I have to write everything about being homosexual? Wouldn't I be interested? If I were homosexual and I'm writing about Sargon of Akkad, why would I have to make, for example, Sargon bisexual? I mean, there's no evidence that he was or whatnot. There's no evidence that he wasn't. But why would I have to bring that into it? People want to always have something but the very fact that they're writing about it says what they are. It's incumbent. You can't. It's inextricable from who they are because no matter how diverse it is, that will say who you are. Period.